So I'd like to welcome members and our witnesses here before us this afternoon, and also viewers who may be watching proceedings on Oireachtas TV to our third public session of the Special Committee on Climate Action. So before I introduce our witnesses today, at the request of the Broadcasting Unit, I would ask our witnesses, our members and people in the gallery to turn off your mobile phones or to switch them onto flight mode as they interfere with the broadcasting service. I'd like to extend on behalf of the committee a sincere welcome to Mr Mark Griffin, Secretary-General of the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment. Also welcome Mr Peter O'Shea, Mr John Lowry and Mr Sean Murphy from the ESB. Finally, I'd like to welcome Mr Jim Shear and Mr John Halpin from the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. They were the officials, sorry, the officials, yeah, from the department. Sorry. Okay, thank you. So before we commence, I just want to begin with some formalities and to advise our witnesses of matters of privilege. So I wish to advise the witnesses that by virtue of Section 17.2L of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons, entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Finally, members are reminded of the long-standing ruling of the Chair to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So I'll now call on Mr Mark Griffin to make your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the invitation to the committee this afternoon. And obviously the Department has been following proceedings with a degree of interest over the last few weeks, and I'm pleased to see that I'm the first Secretary-General to be invited into the committee. Addressing climate change, whether through decarbonisation of our economy or preparing to adapt to the impacts of climate change, is one of the most significant challenges facing this country. It is a complex whole-of-government and whole-of-society issue with long-term impacts that require policy solutions in the near term. The Taoiseach and Minister have each acknowledged that Ireland is playing catch-up on our international and EU obligations. EPA figures published in May of this year project that Ireland's non-ETS emissions may be no lower than 1% below 2005 levels by 2020, in the context of a targeted 20% reduction. These are disappointing figures, but are nonetheless a snapshot reflecting the extent of policy implementation at a particular point in time. Importantly, these figures do not yet include any projected benefit from the significant investments of almost $22 billion on climate action to come over the next decade under the NDP. I want to say something about the complex sectoral challenges involved, as well as outlining progress in a number of areas. On the plus side, we are making progress in relation to renewable electricity. Ireland is recognised as world-leading in its success in integrating intermittent renewable energy generation onto an isolated electricity grid. Preliminary SEAI figures show at the end of 2017, we achieved just over 30% of our electricity consumption from renewable sources, up from 26% in 2015 and from 4.25% in 1997, the base year for the Renewable Energy Directive. Airgrid grid management programmes are recognised as being at the leading edge of global research in this area. By 2030, we have an ambition to achieve at least 55% renewable electricity on the grid, and the recently approved Renewable Electricity Support Scheme will help to deliver on that ambition. The structure of Ireland's economy, with a dispersed population settlement, car-based commuting and the central role of agriculture in the rural economy, all require government to balance economic and societal objectives with the imperative to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We have not yet managed to decouple economic growth from emissions growth in the transport and agriculture sectors, which dominate non-ETS emissions, accounting for 75% of emissions in 2020. The EPA's 2018 reports on greenhouse gas emissions projections show continued emissions growth in these sectors out to 2030 in the absence of further measures. The policy framework to set Ireland on a path towards achieving both its near-term targets as well as its long-term 2050 decarbonisation objective is set out in the National Mitigation Plan published in 2017. This provides a framework to guide government investment decisions in measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from 4 key sectors: electricity generation, built environment, transport and agriculture, forestry and land use. The plan set out 106 actions and 60 measures to reduce our emissions. It is a living document which has been updated on an ongoing basis as analysis, dialogue and technological innovation generate more and more cost-effective sectoral mitigation options. The next update to the plan will be published as part of the 2018 annual transition statement later this year. Implementation of the mitigation plan in this manner means we are making continual incremental inroads into addressing these long-term challenges. It's worth highlighting some of the measures in the National Mitigation Plan that are being actively addressed. Carbon pricing measures through the emissions trading scheme for power generation and large industry with a carbon tax applied to other sectors. Existing support schemes for renewable energy deployment. An ongoing programme of energy efficiency retrofits for the existing housing stock. Implementation of near-zero energy building standards for new residential and commercial buildings. Implementation of the public sector energy efficiency strategy, which targets a 33% efficiency improvement by 2020. Strengthening of the biofuels obligation scheme with the rate of biofuels in the national fuel mix to increase to 10% from the 1st of January next year. Implementation of a range of agri-environment schemes through the 2014 to 2020 Rural Development Programme, including Beef Data and Genomics Programme, the Knowledge Transfer Programme, GLAS and Organic Farming Scheme, and the Forestry Programme with an ambition to increase national forest cover from the current 11% to 18% by mid-century. The committee will already be familiar with the headline commitments on climate action contained in the National Development Plan. These build on existing National Mitigation Plan commitments, and with almost 20% of total NDP funding for 2018 to 2027 to be spent by the state and state companies on climate-related measures, represent a significant step change in our approach both in terms of scale of ambition and the funding needed to meet the climate challenge. Key initiatives included in the NDP are energy efficiency upgrades of 45,000 houses per annum from 2021, and providing support for a major rollout of heat pump technologies. Delivering energy upgrades to BER B level in all public buildings and a minimum of 1/3 of commercial buildings. Implementing the new renewable electricity support scheme to deliver an additional 3,500 to 4,500 megawatts of renewable energy, with the initial focus on shovel-ready projects which could contribute to meeting our 2020 renewable energy targets. The rollout of the support scheme for renewable heat and national smart metering programme. Transitioning the Money Point plant away from coal by the middle of the next decade. Having at least 500,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2030 with additional charging infrastructure to cater for planned growth. A 500 million climate action fund to leverage investment by public and private bodies in innovative climate action measures. And public transport investments with 8.6 billion of funding over the next decade under National Strategic Outcome 4 of the National Development Plan. The combined effect of existing National Mitigation Plan measures and the new NDP commitments are contributing to containing pre-2020 emissions at lower levels than would otherwise be the case, and will also take us some way towards meeting our 2030 target. The preparation of a National Energy and Climate Plan covering 2021 to 2030 is one of the key provisions of the recently agreed EU regulation on the governance of the Energy Union. This is an overarching consolidating regulation that streamlines a large number of energy and climate planning and reporting requirements. The NECP will include trajectories for national emissions, renewable energy and energy efficiency, and will outline measures required to achieve these trajectories. The first draft must be submitted to the European Commission by the 31st of December 2018, with a final version due by the 31st of December next year. We will commence a preliminary consultation on the NECP within the next few weeks. In fact, it may be earlier than that, the findings of which will inform the initial draft NECP with at least one further consultation on the draft plan during 2019. Ireland's NECP will set out our proposed contribution to EU-level targets on renewable energy and energy efficiency, which will be informed both by our NDP commitments and by our ambition to largely decarbonise our energy system by 2040. In the electricity sector, we will see the deployment of additional technologies over the next decade, with solar and offshore wind in particular playing an increasing role. We will further decarbonise the sector by ceasing to use coal and peat in electricity generation. In transport, we will increase our use of sustainable biofuels. move to electrify our car fleet, and deploy renewable gas and compressed natural gas solutions for the heavier commercial fleet. In the heating and cooling sector, we will significantly increase the use of heat pumps and sustainable biomass in the commercial sector. By combining these actions with a robust energy efficiency programme at domestic and commercial levels, we will significantly reduce emissions from the energy sector. A separate requirement of the governance regulation is the preparation by each Member State of a new long-term low-emission strategy. Each strategy must be prepared by the start of 2020, have at least a 30-year time horizon, and contribute to long-term greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the EU in accordance with the Paris Agreement. The strategy will further elaborate sectoral pathways for Ireland to meet its long-term decarbonisation objectives to 2050. We also need to consider how we respond to the impacts of climate change. No matter how successful our mitigation efforts prove to be, we are already locked into a scenario where globally we know we are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Observations show that Ireland's climate is also changing, and the observed scale and rate of change is consistent with regional and global trends. Earlier this year, the Minister published Ireland's first statutory national adaptation framework, which aims to reduce the vulnerability of our environment, society and economy to the impacts of climate change, and thus increase our overall climate resilience. The National Adaptation Framework identifies 12 key sectors on the remit of 7 government departments where sectoral adaptation plans are to be prepared for submission to government for approval by the 30th of December next. Each local authority will also be developing their own adaptation strategies under the national framework. Building capacity within central and local administrations to engage with climate adaptation is very important, particularly at regional and local level. In this regard, the Minister announced in January the establishment of 4 Climate Action Regional Offices to coordinate and drive climate action at local level, and committed $10 million to support their work. Furthermore, the Department is continuing to support the ongoing development of a climate information platform, Climate Ireland, which is providing hands-on training and guidance for the regional teams being established within these offices. In addition, the Department continues to support the EPA Climate Change Research Programme, which plays a critical role in informing responses to adaptation. The Minister and the Government have welcomed the report and recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. Many of the Assembly's recommendations on climate action are already being implemented by the Government. For example, on public sector leadership, the Public Sector Energy Efficiency Strategy requires public bodies to implement the nearly zero energy building standard 2 years in advance of the private sector, and provides a framework for investment in public building retrofits. The new RES scheme provides for communities to develop their own renewable electricity projects and for developer-led projects to offer investment opportunities for local citizens and communities. In relation to sustainable mobility, as I said earlier, Strategic Outcome 4 of the National Development Plan commits to investing $8.6 billion over the next 10 years. Capital funding for cycling and walking infrastructure will increase threefold between 2018 and 2021, with over $110 million allocated for urban cycling and walking infrastructure in our main cities. A strong package of measures to support the rollout of electric vehicles is now in place, supporting the NDP objective of having at least 500,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2030. The Minister is promoting strong action at EU level and in Ireland to address food waste and to reduce packaging, in particular plastics. The Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government is implementing the nearly zero energy building standard for new residential and commercial buildings, which will come into force, I think, from the 1st of January next. Much of the discussion in and around the work of the Citizens' Assembly has focused on the need to recognise the economic and social, in addition to the environmental opportunities of the low-carbon transition. The imperative to take advantage of this opportunity is also made explicit in both the National Policy Position and the 2015 Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act. There is now a large body of international and local evidence that examines the potential gains for the economy in taking strong action to develop the low-carbon economy. The Government's support for energy efficiency measures in our building stock is supported by detailed analysis commissioned by SEAI that evidences not only the savings but also the employment gains, market and supply chain development opportunities and macroeconomic benefit that can be achieved from energy efficiency investments. In 2017 alone, Exchequer investments of $70 million in building energy upgrades supported more than 2,000 jobs across Ireland. Elsewhere, the development of the bioeconomy and the development of stronger emphasis on value-added sustainable food production presents real long-term economic opportunities for Ireland's agriculture and food sectors, which will have the potential for real improvements in the emissions profile of the sector over the longer term. Ireland's publicly funded research is also recognising these opportunities. The recently concluded refresh of our national research priorities has added energy, climate action and sustainability as one of 6 overall themes for the 2018 to 23 period. This will comprise 2 broad pillars of research: decarbonising the energy system and sustainable living. The Citizens' Assembly also demonstrates that individual citizens can produce very clear recommendations when provided with an opportunity to reflect and consider in detail on specific societal change. It also underlines that Ireland will not achieve its climate objectives through government action alone, and engagement with wider society on an ongoing basis will be essential. This is a model the Department intends to develop further through initiatives under the National Dialogue on Climate Action launched by the Minister last year to deliver on the objective of broad societal engagement in the low-carbon transition. A first regional gathering under the auspices of the dialogue took place on the 23rd of June at Loan. Further regional gatherings are currently being planned and details will be announced by the Department in the near future. In conclusion, Chair, the Government is already implementing many of the recommendations made by the Citizens' Assembly and considering the best way to follow through on others. We are implementing long-term climate mitigation and adaptation strategies through the National Mitigation Plan, the National Adaptation Framework and National Development Plan, and will be streamlining our EU climate and energy reporting via the NECP. Citizens are being consulted on how best to tackle climate action through the National Dialogue on Climate Action, and as I said, we will launch a consultation on the NECP very shortly. We have a long way to go and huge challenges ahead. We also have to see and grasp the huge opportunities that exist if we embrace a low-carbon future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Mr. Peter O'Shea, Head of Strategy at the ESB, to make your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to you and the committee have afforded to us this afternoon to brief you on our views in relation to these matters. Climate change is one of the biggest challenges facing humanity, and globally there is a critical need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to protect future generations. And this is widely acknowledged in a range of international agreements and national policy documents that set out ambitious targets to restrict global warming and eliminate greenhouse gases. We in ESB, we welcome the work of the Citizens' Assembly in relation to consideration of climate change, and we greatly welcome the establishment of this dedicated committee to consider climate action. We're particularly encouraged by the fact that the Citizens' Assembly fully accept that climate change is real and have sought for it to be at the centre of policy making in Ireland. For this, the organisers of the Citizens' Assembly should be highly commended. The challenge for us at ESB is to lead that transition where we can, and to do so in the most cost-effective manner for the customer, and we stand ready to do this. When considering climate change and how Ireland can adopt and mitigate its impacts, it's very important that we consider actions in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions. And while there is significant discussion of renewables targets, renewables are but one means to decarbonise. To this end, focus must be first and foremost on greenhouse gas emission reductions to ensure a policy focus that delivers the most cost-effective solution. And I think it's instructive to consider the make-up of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions by reference to a CO2 equivalence. In the most recent data for 2016 by the EPA, they've shown that the total greenhouse gas emissions were just over 61.5 million tonnes of carbon equivalent. Of that 61.5 million tonnes, agriculture is responsible for close to a third of those emissions, and each of electricity generation, transport and heat are responsible for around a fifth. And by 2050, Ireland will need to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sectors, i.e. heat, transport and power generation, by up to 95% to play its part in the global action against climate change. The key narrative of the decarbonisation journey in Ireland to date has been the increase in renewable electricity. In 2016, renewable electricity accounted for over 27% of electricity demand in Ireland, and this number, in our view, is on a trajectory to hit 40% by 2020, driven primarily by wind generation. Ireland is recognised as being at the cutting edge of integrating intermittent renewables onto a small island system, and we should be very proud of our achievements here. More renewable energy will be required, but ESB believes action is required in other areas as well. We have given significant consideration to how Ireland might decarbonise, and in late 2017 we published a report in conjunction with Powery entitled Ireland's Low Carbon Future. I have a copy here if members wish to see it. The report entitled Ireland's Low Carbon Future: Dimensions of a Solution, and it considered broader energy emissions in a holistic manner, namely all the emissions from heat, transport and electricity, and set out a series of low target recommendations informed by international precedent right across the various energy sectors. These recommendations form a key part of ESB's own Brighter Future strategy. So the key tenet of the Dimensions report is that increased electrification of heat and transport, underpinned by the decarbonisation of electricity through zero or close to zero carbon technologies. And to achieve this, we need to consider three dimensions. The first, we need to get ready now for a transport modal evolution, where a significant proportion of the vehicle fleet transitions from internal combustion engines to electric motor-propelled vehicles. To achieve this, we need to put in place a comprehensive network of public charging infrastructure, and we need to look at prioritising and electrifying public transport and increasing the use of electrified rail freight. Since the charging infrastructure must be in place to provide public confidence in purchasing an electric vehicle, we believe state support is required for this infrastructure, as it has been in many other jurisdictions, and we will be putting forward our case for support in due course through initiatives like the Climate Action Fund. The second dimension, we need to decarbonise Ireland's heating requirements through a variety of measures. Existing housing and commercial stock should have an energy efficiency retrofit to significantly reduce energy consumption on the basis that using less energy in the first place reduces the decarbonisation problem. Retrofit programmes represent huge opportunities for new employment right across Ireland and also have enormous benefits in terms of Ireland's balance of payments. All of the 500,000 expected new homes in the coming decades should have a heat pump installed rather than a fossil fuel burner, especially as the cost implications for new homes are negligible. The same applies to new commercial buildings. Existing fossil fuel heat sources should be replaced by electric pumps where possible. Otherwise, biomass or biogas should be considered. However, we need to note that both fuel sources, the quantities are constrained by raw material availability. The third dimension is in order to underpin the scale of electrification, we need to decarbonise the electricity system. Undoubtedly, renewable technologies like onshore and offshore wind and solar PV will play a massive part, as will storage and interconnection with other markets. However, even with significant renewables, Ireland will still need a backbone of dispatchable generation to meet the needs of society when it's neither windy nor sunny. Unlike many other electricity systems around the world, Ireland does not have significant hydropower potential. Biomass is a limited resource for many reasons, and we have an outright ban on nuclear generation. ESB is of the view that carbon capture and storage technology will be required in Ireland given the lack of alternatives to complement renewables. We believe Ireland needs to act now to consider CCS in a specific Irish context, and we greatly welcome the establishment of a dedicated government-led working group to explore this option fully. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'll now call on Mr. Jim Shear, Head of Department of Low Carbon Technologies at the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland.
Thanks very much. Thanks to the committee and to the Chair for the opportunity to address you today. SEAI is Ireland's national energy authority investing in and delivering appropriate, effective and sustainable solutions to help Ireland's transition to a clean energy future. We work with government, homeowners, businesses and communities, providing expertise, capital funding, educational programs, policy advice and research, development and demonstration support for new technologies. As part of SEAI's remit to contribute to the evidence base for policy making in Ireland, this is supported by RD&D, statistics and modelling functions. We use a broad range of data sources, including data collected from the programs delivered by SEAI. We administer the National Energy Modelling Framework as part of our statutory functions. We execute this in partnership with a range of domestic organisations, departments and state agencies with expertise in the Irish economy and energy sector, and with international organisations such as the European Commission, the International Energy Agency and Eurostat. Our modelling function is central to the preparation of the National Energy and Climate Plan. SEAI have direct experience of incentivising and delivering measures that reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the residential, commercial, public, industrial and transport sectors. In a separate advisory note to the committee, we outline a summary of some of the key measures we are delivering that align with the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. I will highlight a short selection of these key opportunities now. Ireland's public sector building stock represents a significant opportunity for the Government of Ireland to take a leadership role in our low-carbon transition. By the end of 2017, the public sector in Ireland had reached a level of 20% energy savings from energy efficiency, meeting the overall 2020 national target. However, further work needs to be done to reach the 33% efficiency improvement savings target, as was set by government for the public sector beyond the national target. To facilitate this, SEAI has run an award-winning public sector program for a number of years, funded by the DCCAE. The program delivers material impact through capital projects, mentoring on energy management and capacity building within state bodies such as the HSE, OPW, local authorities and the Department of Education and Skills. The program includes a strong monitoring and reporting mechanism requiring all public bodies and schools to engage with their energy performance annually and work towards the 33% target. The program has a strong focus on capacity building within state entities to make sustainable energy practices the norm in the Irish public sector. SEAI is developing a long-term pipeline of projects to assure high impact and cost-effective delivery of sustainable energy retrofits. This aggregation model will allow non-exchequer funding to be brought to bear as volume increases to meet Ireland's ambition. SEAI is currently working with state bodies to pursue non-exchequer finance alternatives. There is also a clear opportunity to deliver significant upgrades of homes through state-owned housing. The use of this stock as an exemplar national government-led program represents an immediate opportunity to meet our residential retrofit targets. Delivering actions that connect citizens to the need to act is also vitally important. Recognising the importance of community participation in the transition to a low-carbon society, in 2017 SEAI commissioned an assessment of models to support community ownership of renewable energy in Ireland. This supported development of options to provide for community renewable energy development and deployment via the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. In addition to this input to the RES development process, SEAI has been supporting microgeneration technologies through programs delivered on behalf of government for several years. In 2018, SEAI removed support for fossil fuel boilers and added grants for heat pumps, solar PV and domestic battery storage. As the EU Clean Energy Package starts to facilitate the generation, export and receipt of a market price for microgeneration export, the evidence base provided by these pilot programs nationwide will help to de-risk this transition. With this evidence base, Ireland should be able to deliver the best fit market mechanism at optimal cost to the exchequer and high value to the consumer. In further support of communities, over the last 3 years, SEAI has grown the Sustainable Energy Communities Network, which today boasts over 200 communities spread across the country. We provide technical mentoring, advice and funding for communities to develop their own energy master plan. This process identifies the opportunities for them as they determine their own low-carbon transition, including the potential for renewable energy. Through both the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme and by looking at other market constraints, it is essential that communities are empowered to invest in renewable energy projects where these are economically, socially and environmentally sustainable. SEAI will continue to work with the various departments and regulatory bodies to help to ensure that this becomes a reality. SEAI delivers Ireland's grants for electric vehicles, for new electric vehicle purchases and for home chargers with funding from DCCAE. We are also engaged with the motor industry in delivering roadshows at various events and locations to increase the level of test driving and user experience. Through the latter half of 2018, we will finalise a fleet replacement program which supports public and private sector businesses to test a range of EVs alongside their existing fleet and consider switching to electric vehicles. Our data shows that in 2018, EV sales in Ireland will likely double as a result of the various incentives, including the grants, toll charges, benefit in kind, and fleet and taxi purchase schemes. As adoption of EVs grows, it is increasingly important that the charging infrastructure meets demand. In our role supporting the Low Emissions Vehicles Task Force, co-chaired by DCCAE and Department of Transport, SEAI will be central to the provision of this infrastructure and a transition to low-emission vehicles. Price signals that drive low-carbon investment and behaviour are key. An extension to the carbon tax could play a crucial role in reducing energy demand and greenhouse gas emissions, especially if a long-term trajectory is sent as a clear market signal. In many countries, the ring-fencing of carbon tax for climate mitigation activities can help to finance cost-effective, sustainable energy interventions. It also links the taxation more directly to heightened awareness of its need and impact. There is, of course, a much longer list of actions than I have had time to mention here. Many of these are detailed in Government's National Development Plan and highlighted in other government policy papers. and include opportunities for example, district heating, decarbonising gas, electrifying heat and transport, and activities to further decarbonise electricity, transport and heat and promote energy efficiency, all of which are required to achieve our goals. The Department have highlighted for you already the relevance of the upcoming National Energy and Climate Plan. To highlight SEAI's contribution to the plan, in its review of National Energy and Climate Plans, the European Commission will consider Member States' NECP commitments against the outputs from a new EU model. SEAI is supporting DCCAE and liaising with EU officials to ensure that that model is based on the latest available data for Ireland. Further to these inputs, SEAI provides a central supporting role to DCCAE via development of energy projections for Ireland to 2030 and 2040 as part of our statutory authority to produce the national energy statistics and national energy projections. These will meet many of the analytical requirements of the National Energy and Climate Plan. The scenarios are being developed in consultation with the Department, other key stakeholders. We are further supporting the Department across wider policy development, research, demonstration and deployment, and innovation on sustainable energy activities. The EU's recent suite of legislation, including the governance regulation, mandate minimum levels of effort for Member States to adhere to in terms of emissions reductions across the economy. Member States are, however, fully entitled to design more ambitious plans. This is crucial as it is currently unclear as to whether the EU targets are ambitious enough to deliver on the commitments under the Paris Agreement. Against this backdrop, SEAI is grateful for the support and resources committed to us via DCCAE. We are committed to supporting this committee and wider government to transform Ireland into a society based on sustainable energy, technology and practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're going to follow the same speaking pattern. Again, I have maybe Marcella, Corcoran Kennedy. You might take Senator Mulherin's place. You're on my list. Then I have Senator O'Sullivan. Then Deputy Dooley, and this Senator Ian Marshall. They're the first. Yeah, and then we'll go into Deputy Stanley after that. So we're going to have our 10-minute speakers at the beginning. We have a grid here, and then Deputy Stanley, you'll be the first on our 5-minute slots. We have a copy of it up here if you want to see it. I might just start with my own questions for a number of you, and if you want to just take note of them and come back in. So I might just start maybe with the Department. You made reference there to the National Development Plan and the measures over the next 10 years that will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But there's no analysis done on that, you say. When will that analysis take place? And do you believe that we'll reach our 2030 targets based on the National Development Plan? Also, in relation to the burning of peat for electricity, as we know, it has a significant impact on our carbon emissions. There are also sustainability questions that arise from importing biomass fuel, depending on where it's coming from. Shouldn't we have strict sustainability criteria in relation to the importation of biomass, and what would your views be on that? We're going to, as a committee, visit the Tipperary Energy Agency in a number of weeks, where we'll see community-owned wind farms in Ireland. We'll hear from the community where they have solar panels, where they are working collectively at a community level in relation to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And that there's clear expert evidence that community and citizen participation works in relation to our energy transition. So what are you doing as a department? What initiatives and supports are out there in order to roll this out across the country? This is an example that is clearly working very well, and we need to hear concrete proposals from the department in relation to what you're doing to help us reach our targets. And what discussions have the department had with the ESB in terms of allowing this citizen participation and allowing people to sell their surplus energy onto the grid? In relation to offshore electricity generation as part of the solution, we heard last week that there are a number of issues in relation to that around planning, regulation and licensing in relation to building offshore wind farms, and just where are we at in relation to dealing with those challenges? And also, what is the capacity of the grid in order to take on that and distribute it around the state and to feed it into Europe? just one last one in relation to the Department of Education. Again, last week the committee was told that, and I know the SEAI have made reference to that here today, the SEAI were, the Department of Education have advised that heat pumps are unsuitable for new schools, and that any unused energy generated from solar panels had to be spilled. So it was stated previously that schools were ideal for solar and PV panels, as they could export it to the grid when the school is closed at the weekend and during the summer, and therefore generating money for hard-pressed schools. So again, where are we now in relation to government policy in relation to microgeneration, and again looking at a more joined-up approach in relation to departments and our public buildings having access to these supports through the Oireachtas scheme. So I don't know, Mr. Griffin, if you want to start with those, and I'll bring in the other members.
I'd better start on some of those before I'm inundated. So the National Development Plan, I gave you a sense in the presentation as to the range of measures that are set out in the National Development Plan. I think any fair observer would say that the plan is very, very ambitious in terms of what it wants to do in the climate front and in relation to renewable energy. And you're really, really seeing a very significant step change in investment as compared to previous years. I mean, the reality is we were moving, and the figures showed, from a period of significant underinvestment for a whole range of reasons in climate action and renewable energy into a space now where €1 in 5 to be invested on the National Development Plan will be on climate action measures. We've done an analysis, if I could just step it back a small bit, on the National Mitigation Plan, which preceded the NDP. We've done a detailed analysis of the contribution towards our carbon targets, our carbon reduction targets in relation to each of the national mitigation measures where that data is available. The next big step for us is, as a number of us have said in our presentations, is the development of the National Energy and Climate Plan. And what that will require the system to do is to look at what it is we have now agreed at EU level in terms of the various targets. So 32% renewable energy target, which is an EU-wide target, 32.5% energy efficiency target, a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the non-ETS sector, and other sub-targets which don't get as much prominence, like a target for interconnection. And we need to set out in great detail for the European Commission how the totality of existing measures and measures yet to be identified and designed and put in place will make towards achievement of those whole range of targets. And that work has started. We expect the first consultation of the NECP to go out in the next week or two. We will be engaged and are engaged already in the department on some of the preliminary drafting work. We circulated a document to the committee in the last day or so on the role of the tram, and the tram is really critical to all of this in modelling the impact of the various measures, and all of that work will be fed into the NECP. On the issue of peat and the sustainability of peat in terms of electricity generation, what we've said in the National Development Plan, and the Minister has stated in the House on a couple of occasions, our intention is to get out of peat no later than 2030. Our intention is to get out of coal in terms of the Money Point plant no later than 2025. And on the latter, a lot of in-depth analysis is ongoing in the department, and particularly ESB as a plant owner, as to how we achieve that. But I think it's important to say, and this is something that we're acutely conscious of in the department, that, you know, saying something like getting out of peat needs to be understood in the context of the importance of the plants to the Midlands. And there is a commitment in the National Mitigation Plan that we would prepare a report on the just transition and how we manage a situation where there are 4,000 people in the Midlands that are directly or indirectly supported through Bordemona's activities. The other thing worth saying, and so that work is ongoing. The other thing worth saying in terms of the perspective of Pete and Bordemona as an entity. Bordemona have already made significant progress in decarbonisation, energy generation in the plants for which they are responsible. By 2024, about 85% of the electricity generated by Bordemona will be renewable electricity. So you'll have a combination of co-firing at the 3 existing plants, 2 of them of which are owned by ESB, but you also have a very significant investment by Bordemona on wind energy, and they're also getting into the solar energy space as well. So the company are very, very active and conscious of the need to get the transition right, not just from the point of view of environmental sustainability, but also ensuring that in doing it in a particular way, that they ensure that the company remains a very, very significant part of the Midlands. On the microgen, and I might ask a colleague to come in on this, we did some initial survey work on, there's 2 components to it. There's the existing scheme, which is run by ESB, which were the only electricity supplier to offer a microgen scheme. And there is the new scheme that the Minister launched over the summer. And that is a scheme which supports solar PV and battery storage up to a maximum of 3,800, so 2,800 for the solar PV and 1,000 for battery. We have said that we would review the scheme after a reasonable time after it is up and running to see how it is functioning. And in the meantime, we're given thought to what are the impacts of allowing, and this is self-consumption at the moment, what are the impacts of allowing spilling of that electricity onto the grid, and how we manage that from an electricity supply perspective, what the impacts of the PSO are, and so on. So there's a bit of work to be done around that before we embark on a more extensive microgen. But we're conscious as well that the second renewable energy directive, which was just negotiated at EU level, is very, very clear that the community has to be at the heart of it. And I think when you're affecting a transformational change of the nature that we have to achieve over the next number of decades, you can't do it without community involvement at all levels. So that's about involving communities in the decision making, making sure communities are more active, engaged from a generation perspective. Microgen is part of that. We've also written into the RES provisions around community involvement in renewable electricity schemes. So, for example, a developer would be required to allocate a certain proportion of the scheme for community involvement. There will be the traditional community contributions we expect developers to continue to make. And we would also expect that in the auctions that we will be running over future years, that there will be a component of that will be available for communities to bid into. And obviously we have to look at how that bidding in is financed and how we support them in that way. The planning, regulation and licensing, there's work ongoing led by the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government in terms of the development of a Marine Area and Foreshore Amendment Bill. That will provide the licensing and regulatory framework to allow developments in the offshore as distinct from the foreshore to take place, because there's already a mechanism in place to consent schemes within the foreshore area. You mentioned grid capacity. I think the reality is, when you look at the demand scenarios, even under the low carbon scenario that EirGrid has prepared looking out to 2030, the reality is we will need to continue to invest in grid, whether that's reinforcements or additional grid. And we also need, for a number of reasons, to develop our grid connections to the EU We have one that's beyond the feasibility study stage at this stage, which is the Celtic interconnector between here and France, about 700 kilometres, I think about €1 billion in cost. That will make a real difference in terms of the connectivity that we will require. There is a private sector company who are promoting a Green Link project which will introduce a further grid connection between Ireland and Wales. We already have the existing grid connection, 500 megawatt between ourselves and the UK. So that kind of, I know it's a quick run through the questions you posed, Chair. There's one final point that I'm not sure that I'm in a position to answer, but perhaps the SEAI are, and that is the issue around the schools, and I don't want to land the SEAI in this.
Just in relation to the just transition, is it not time to have a task force that is set up? Where is that at the moment in relation to the task force?
We have a commitment to the National Mitigation Plan to develop a report on the just transition, which will focus more than just on the Bordemona issue. And that report is to, I think the timeline we had for that is 2019 for initiating and finalising a report in that area. And obviously we'll have to involve all the stakeholders. This isn't something that we'll take upon ourselves to do.
A task force set up in relation to transitioning people from...
In all likelihood, that's what will be required. I mean, we haven't finally settled on the shape of it, but we will need to talk to people who are directly affected by it.
So that's not going to happen till... Next year. Next year. Yeah. At what point next year, do you know?
I don't have a precise time at this stage, but we'll, if you look at, we have 106 or 60 measures to move under the National Mitigation Plan. We'll move that as quickly as we can because we understand the priority that should be attached to it.
And just in relation to the National Development Plan again and the reduction of our greenhouse gas emissions and those analyses, based on the analysis that you've done to date, when can we expect to start seeing the graph turn downwards in relation to our improvements in relation to our greenhouse gas emissions? Because the Advisory Council, the Climate Change Advisory Council, who have come before us, have been very negative in relation to are working towards our 2020 targets. So when do you feel that we're going to get, I suppose, a proper picture in relation to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, given the announcement of the National Development Plan?
Yeah, so we'll have to have the full picture in place by the time we submit a National Energy and Climate, a final national Energy and Climate Plan to the European Commission by the end of next year.
The end of 2019?
And what that will have to do is, as I said at the outset, look at all the targets that we have to deliver: renewable energy, energy efficiency, greenhouse gas emissions, interconnection, redesigning the markets and all the rest, and that it'll have to add up.
So we'll be able to see a clear projection graph in relation to our greenhouse gas emissions reducing.
And the work that the TRAM are doing, the SEAI involvement in that, UCC, ESRI, all of that will feed into the process. So this will be a very well informed plan, no room for equivocation, which is really, really important, and it will be informed as well by the public consultation processes which we will run.
Okay. Do the SEAI want to come in on any on the school issue?
On the matter of the schools, you referenced the heat pumps and the suitability of photovoltaic. With heat pumps, the general underlying principle is that the building itself must be energy efficient in the first instance to make them economically viable. So it's not a blanket that they're not suitable, it's just that certain building stock may not be suitable. Having said that, SEAI is actively engaged with the Department of Education and Skills, and we're engaged in a programme, DCCAE funded programme, 14 million over 3 years, to do deep retrofits of 30 schools, and I believe heat pumps will feature in those.
But in relation to new schools, though, new schools that are being built, would it not, putting in PV solar panels into new schools?
Well, the issue with photovoltaic is different in that with photovoltaic, where the occupancy of a school may not justify it and you end up, as you say, spilling the electricity to the grid, then it's uneconomically viable. However, in instances, and we're supporting them through our community scheme and also in the instance of the schools programme, we're supporting PV where the occupancy extends into later in the evening, or indeed the school is used extensively during the summer. when you obviously get a higher level of availability of solar. So it's not a blanket, doesn't fit, but the Department of Education have strong guidelines on this, and it's not always suitable.
It's not always suitable for new schools. Is that what you're saying?
Sorry, I can't comment in respect of new schools. I'm not familiar with the specific guidelines, regulations, how that interacts with regulations. But with respect to retrofitting it onto existing schools, it's not always suitable.
These sorts of buildings will also be covered by the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. Now, I don't have the detail on that, but there are obligations around that. One would imagine that have to be similar to the obligations for dwellings under the near zero energy buildings.
That's a great question. Did any of the witnesses here watch Máire Donnelly's presentation last week?
I didn't watch it, no.
If you watched that, you'd understand the question.
You said you were watching the committee's work very closely.
I beg your pardon?
You said you were watching the committee's work very closely.
No, I said I was paying close attention. I don't have time. I don't have time to sit through all the presentations, unfortunately.
So you were paying close attention. You weren't paying that close
I have
attention.
one question actually for the ESB in relation to the infrastructure, and you made reference to needing government support in order to roll that out. And can you explain the reason exactly why you would need, if we're going to have this transition to replace electricity will replace petrol, diesel cars, obviously that would be a very positive business model for the ESB. Can you just elaborate on why you would need government intervention supports in order to roll out infrastructure for electric vehicles?
You know, it's a fair question. So if we're to move from the current internal combustion engine driven transport system to charging systems, we presently have around 1,100 public charging points across Ireland. We have more up in Northern Ireland, and we put them in place on foot of a scheme that was agreed with the regulator. As we look forward, there's more than ESB, first of all, looking to put in place new charging mechanisms. But to do so on a commercial basis, you have to get a return on the asset. And if you look, for example, at some of the businesses we're doing in GB right now, we're engaged in both London and in Coventry in schemes where they're effectively local authority run schemes where you bid in and on foot of winning a bid you build the charging point. So it's all about the economics of it. You don't make money from the electricity being provided from the unit to any great extent, and the unit is quite capital intensive. So you know, we welcome the Climate Action Fund and the availability of monies from that to ensure that we can put in place a more comprehensive scheme of chargers into the future.
Just on the point of the schools, Chair, I mean, I'd be happy to take it up with the Department of Education and feed something back into the clerk, which might provide a bit of clarity around that.
Yes. I just think for the building of new schools, if we can't get it right in a new building, it raises serious questions in relation to energy efficiency within our public buildings. If this is a scheme that is supported or seen as being a positive for energy efficiency. I'm going to bring in our speakers here, so I might start with Deputy Marcella Corcoran-Kennedy.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you all for coming in here this afternoon. I just have a question for Mr. Griffin in relation to the recommendation 1 of the Citizens' Assembly around a single organisation responsible for ensuring that we achieve our targets. And, you know, we've been receiving different views on that, and there seems to be an emerging view that a cross-departmental, very senior level committee of Secretary-Generals in each of the departments, maybe answerable to the Taoiseach's office, would be a good model to pursue. And I note that the National Adaptation Framework has 7 government ministers who are producing sectoral adaptation plans by next year. I just wonder what your views are in relation to that. And the other question was in relation to getting information out to the citizen. We'd heard about the terrific work of the Tipperary Energy Agency and indeed a number of the other agencies across the country who are doing work, but it's clearly not in every county. And I note that you have the 4 climate action regional offices. Are they going to be operating in each local authority, or is it actually more regional, such as the regional assemblies level? Also, the proposal which I have made, and indeed many others, around communication to the citizen via RT and Mulherin, if that's something that your department would approve of, considering that the RT comes under your own remit. I know Mulherin is environment, however I've no doubt that it's something that cross-departmentally you could work on. The other one then is in relation to the RESS scheme. about communities developing the renewable electricity projects, and whether or not that is something that you would see farmers, for example, being able to avail of, because an awful lot of them are very interested in the PV potential there, and whether or not models which are European, for example, to enable them to, connect into the grid, supply their own electricity and then sell it, if that's something that you would see as coming in onto that particular scheme, just from the ESB.
The ESB.
No, sorry, Griffin. Yeah.
So if I can take the first one first, and Deputy, I think it'd be helpful to maybe set out the structures that are in place to manage this across government, to give a very clear sense that there is the level of join-up in place across government departments at official level and indeed at government level in dealing with this issue. So I suppose the first thing to say, the government took the view back in 2016 when the government was formed that we should have a climate action and energy department, and that's why my department inherited the climate functions from the Custom House in 2016, and we have been managing both policy agendas since then. There's Oireachtas oversight through the annual transition statement process, and since last year each sectoral minister is required to go in and brief the Oireachtas on progress in their own areas. On the delivery of the National Mitigation Plan and the National Adaptation Framework, there's a high-level steering group chaired by the Minister, which has the senior officials from the relevant departments feeding into that. There's cabinet-level oversight by a cabinet committee, and we have this year has been quite active, in fact, in looking at the climate issue. And there is indeed, as you would expect, cabinet consideration of this matter from time to time. And again, we've been to cabinet on a number of climate and energy-related issues during the course of 2018. The Cabinet Committee is fed by a senior officials group. The representation is generally at Assistant Secretary level, so Michael would be a regular attendee at that, along with Brian Carlow, who's the Assistant Secretary over the climate area. And I suppose a new innovation, for want of a better term, is we have the Project Ireland 2040 Delivery Group. So that is a group that comprises the relevant Secretary-Generals that have responsibility for areas mandated in the National Development Plan. So I sit on that as chaired by Robert Watt, the Secretary-General in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and co-chaired by John McCarthy, the Sec-Gen in Department of Housing. You have the Health Sec-Gen, Culture and the Gaeltacht, Community and Rural Development, Transport, Education. So there's a good cross spectrum of government departments that are tasked with delivering very significant outcomes under the National Development Plan, including not least climate-related outcomes that sit on that group, meets generally once a month, reports into government on a regular basis. The first report was last week. So there are, and I suppose the other thing to say, just from my perspective as a Secretary-General of a government department, big-ticket items that arise on the climate or energy area, whether it's new policy or policy development or commitment of money or discussions around estimates which affect this in particular, it'll all come through me. So I do believe we have a very good framework in place to manage what needs to be managed on this front. In truth, I'm not sure the value that a new independent body will provide. I mean, the other independent body that's out there, and you've already met John Fitzgerald as the Climate Change Advisory Council, and John calls it very straight, and he was very straight with the committee in terms of what he thought was going well and not so well in terms of our climate agenda. So we're obviously very cognizant of that, and we listen very closely to what the Advisory Council say, and obviously Laura Burke as a as an ex officio member. Jim Gannon, the head of the CAI, is an ex officio member, and other eminent members are well equipped to assess the issue and to make recommendations, as they have done on a number of occasions. So on that particular issue, I think we're pretty well geared up. I'll ask John O'Neill to talk about the Climate Action Regional Offices, because John has been very heavily involved in the national adaptation area for quite some time now, and was instrumental in setting up of the offices. And I'm going to ask Michael Manley then to come in on the RES scheme, in particular the community dimension.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Deputy, you mentioned the 7 adaptation plans actually kind of across the 12 sectors, and I think that's an important point to raise in terms of the policy coherence side of things. So we do have a national steering committee in place with all the sectors, so all the government departments who can interact in that, and they only met yesterday actually kind of on this. So they meet quite frequently, and I think the whole idea is to have that cross-sectoral kind of interaction at that sectoral level. And taking that governance point a bit further, the local authorities are also represented on that group, as are the regional assemblies. And as Mark mentioned in his opening statement, the Minister made 10 million available earlier this year to set up kind of 4 regional climate action offices. And they were set up on a kind of a regional basis to initially deal with, I suppose, the climate risks. So we have Cork County Council, who are dealing with the southwest, Mayo dealing with the northwest region, Dublin City Council is actually kind of coordinating for the Dublin region, and Kildare then for the Midlands. And I suppose those regional offices, their role is to coordinate activity on the climate action agenda with all the local authorities within their particular region. The initial focus for these offices is on the adaptation side. So in terms of because not only do the sectors have to do their own kind of sectoral plans for adaptation by September of next year, the local authorities have the same deadline to kind of meet as well. But we think, I suppose, kind of the idea behind the local authority offices is to kind of put some capacity building at the local and regional level. It's been mentioned several times in terms of the overall climate action agenda, and that will span not just the adaptation side, but will include the mitigation side as well. Thank you.
Someone else want to come? Sorry, do you want to come? Yeah.
Back on one thing that I neglected to answer before I hand over to Michael, and that's the question you raised in relation to the role of Mulherin and RTE. So, I think the best way to frame it is that, Mulherin are very, very heavily involved in the analysis and support of a lot of this work, particularly on the adaptation side. I mean, they would have been very involved in the National Adaptation Steering Group and contributed to the development of the National Adaptation Framework, which was published some time back. They also sit on the steering group for the Climate Action Regional Offices. They're involved in the Climate Information Platform, Climate Ireland, which I mentioned in my opening statement, and obviously centrally involved again from a long-term adaptation perspective with their climatological analysis forecasts and so on. And they're establishing a national flood forecast and warning service. So they're usually involved in the space. In terms of RTE and the role they could have in public awareness, I think we would need to think about what it is we want the organisation to do. And if we're going out with a communications campaign, it would want to be structured extremely well. I would see value, and this is just off the top of the head, in a programme like Nationwide being involved in this space. And obviously there are other environmental programmes that RTE run, like Ear to the Ground.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just in relation to using the weather forecasting as a good opportunity to get information out.
Well, we could look at that and certainly talk to our colleagues. I mean, there may be value in them sort of saying something on this issue from time to time as part of the public-facing role of Mulherin, and we'll take that up with them. I suppose our biggest area of focus in terms of public awareness to date has been around the National Dialogue on Climate Action and how we get that bottom-up, local, regional engagement and engage citizens at all levels in ensuring that they contribute to the process of achieving that transformational change we're going to require over the next few decades. I'll ask Michael to come in on the RES schemes and the microgen.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say thank you, Secretary General. Actually, thank you, Chairperson. Look, on microgeneration, our system of energy and electricity particularly is hugely changing. 20 years ago, with a monolithic ESB, it did all the generation, did all the transmission, did all the retailing. And over the last 20 years, unbundling has been the key issue and bringing in new actors in the supply of electricity and generation of electricity. And what's in the Clean Energy Package is the next step, the next change, bringing the citizen, the community into that space. And it's going to require an enormous amount of work. I mean, we're looking at it at a number of different levels. In the RES scheme, which is look fairly at scale production of energy, we're trying to find, can we find a way to put communities into commercial projects? So the RES is providing for a mandatory participation and systems to do that. That's at commercial scale. There will be smaller schemes then which we envisage will be community-led. And we're looking at how can we support those? How can we look at models of giving early support finance so people can come together and get their ideas together and work out? And that. How can we put expert supports in there? Because there'll be very few communities anywhere in the country who'll be able to say, well, what about design, construction, financing and all those kind of things? And then how you put long-term finance on board on that. And then there's a smaller scale again, which is microgeneration. And this is where people can just put, say, solar on their roof and they can spill it in. But that raises huge questions of equity. Italy this summer has had significant problems where sunny Sunday afternoons, not a lot of electricity demand, a lot of solar, and it's spilling into the grid. And its commercial generators then are losing revenue, and they're looking at how they recover that. These are not insurmountable things. We have to try to design a market that accommodates all that. And we can't afford, and we won't be recalcitrant because we talk about the Clean Energy Package and it tends to be a focus on the renewable and efficiency objectives and that one. But there are 4 market instruments as well, which hopefully will come to Council this December. And just to very quickly say, Article 16 of the Electricity Market Directive says communities are entitled to own, establish or lease community networks and autonomously manage them. Article 21, generate renewable energy, including their own consumption, store and sell their excess production of renewable electricity. And Article 22, renewable energy for communities, generate, consume, store and sell renewable energy. We are going to have to legislatively bring those into operation in Ireland. Deadline will be 2021, but it's going to profoundly change how we do things. The steps we take at the moment are only start. I mean, I know there's very few people, many people are happy to get a grant support for microgeneration, others want to be much more actively involved in the market. And we want to have to design a market which welcomes those who want to be active in the market and the very many then citizens who won't, who'll be quite happy not to be involved. And at this level, the European consumer bodies have been very active, pointing out that consumers are busy people. They're trying to get to work, care for kids, get to childcare, do all the things they want to do. Some will be very interested, others won't. So that's going to be a pretty complex market. The specific question on farmers getting involved, there'll be no badges that farmers need not apply. But is a farmer developing something on his own land, a commercial developer and therefore in the commercial pot, or are they working together with their community so there's a broader support and therefore they're in a community project? And we've met some of the community groups and had this discussion with them. When is community commercial? If a number of businesses come together, is that community or is that commercial? And we have to work these things through.
Thank you. Just a question for the ESB. You're talking about the carbon capture and storage technology and that we're going to need that. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean about there?
Okay, carbon capture and storage technology is technology whereby you continue to burn the fossil fuel, but you capture the carbon either pre-combustion or post-combustion. You transport it to another site and you store it. So carbon doesn't find its way into the atmosphere. It's a technology which is, the different parts of it have been tried and tested. There's 3,000 kilometres of carbon network in the US, for example. But it hasn't had the same push over the last 10 odd years. And it's just, we feel it's a technology which needs some further support. I think when you look across the various roadmaps across Europe, generally carbon capture and storage features heavily in each of them as a means of ensuring that that the carbon is stopped from going into the atmosphere, and that we can continue to run the system through a combination of renewables but also thermal plant.
And what about the, say, flywheel technology, battery storage? What have you a view on that?
I think all of these technologies will have a part to play, but there's limits in what they can achieve. Battery technology is advancing steadily. The energy density of batteries is increasing day by day, week by week, and that is what's providing the real emphasis on electrification of transport and electric vehicles. But they're limited enough in the actual storage that an individual device can actually provide. But when you use the law of large numbers and put a lot of them together, then you start to get to something which is useful. But I've said at this committee previously, I think 18 months ago, that the overall committee 18 months ago, that if we're to store 1 day's worth of electricity in Ireland, and we're to store it, say, in the Turlock Hill type power plants, 1 day for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, we'd have to build 60 new Turlock Hills, 60. Now that's a massive storage capability, but also it's a level of implementation that is incredible right now. Equally, if we're to store 1 day's worth of electricity in batteries, and you're to take, say, the Tesla Powerwall battery, which is currently available commercially, it's a 10 kilowatt hour battery, you would need something like 14 million of them on houses in Ireland. So again, that's 6 or 7 batteries on the side of every house. So again, it sort of says to me that there is something that can certainly contribute there, but it probably can't achieve a full day's worth of energy storage. So look, the challenges are real, and that's why we would say in ESB that when we look at the various technologies, don't discount any of them, because the challenge is so big. We have to get to the end of this, and there's a part to play for each one of these.
And would you have any resistance to the idea that the individual citizen could generate electricity for themselves and connect into the grid and sell? Is that something? Because certainly there might be some impression that that's the case. Yeah,
look, and I've heard those impressions, and I suppose firstly in our networks business, you can actually turn up and notify and fit your installation, your wind, your micro generation installation. And in fact, you can actually turn up and fit up to 3.6 kilowatts on a domestic premise, right? Now, just to give you an indication what 3.6 kilowatts is, it's around 12 solar panels. If you go to three-phase supply, well, then it's larger. It's about 10 kilowatts, which is about 40 solar panels. Now, in Europe, they bring three-phase supply closer to domestic premises than we do in Ireland or the UK, so the capacity is lower. But we will be well beyond the requirements of the new Renewables Directive in terms of being able to just turn up and connect your plant to the system. Then when we look at the commercials, so that's the technical piece of it. When we then look at the commercials of it, and in the past, we first of all think that when the smart metering scheme is actually put in place, it'll be a game changer in this respect, because now you're actually measuring electricity imports and exports, and now from each individual home, and now we can actually work out what the value of it is. And the RES package at European level will require a value to be placed on that and payments to the customer. But over the last couple of years, in advance of that, we've run 2 pilot schemes. One in our supply business, Electric Ireland, where we've offered a tariff of, I think it's 10 cents per unit to existing customers. Now, we've had to stop offering that. It's not available to new customers, but we've maintained it now for the eighth year in a row. And I think, to the best of my knowledge, we're the only electricity supplier who's actually offered that to its customer base, to actually buy the electricity, to pay the customer for electricity spilled from either solar panels or any other local micro-generation. In addition, in our networks business, we offered a package to install the kit and to provide an import-export meter. And on top of that, we offered 10 cents per unit of electricity generated from it. And in the networks business, that cost was effectively socialised across all customers for a period. But again, it was a pilot to see how the network would operate under these conditions. It hasn't been continued because we've done the learning from it. But I think ESB is at the forefront of looking to do these sort of initiatives. In Electric Ireland right now, we offer a package for existing customers whereby we'll give an interest-free loan to install some of these capabilities. And again, it's been taken up in reasonable numbers.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'm now going to move on to Senator O'Sullivan. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentations. I suppose I'm always reminded of the technology, the mobile phone, and say 25, 30 years ago, where you were carrying a large big battery cell around with you, and now it's such a small device. And so for me, the challenge is something that we should embrace, and particularly with regard to renewable energy and a healthy environment to live in. I have a number of questions to Mark, just with regard to the National Energy and Climate Plan. What would you see the role of this committee with regard to the development of that plan? You said that there would be consultation, so I'm just wondering if there's a role for the committee there and how you would see that. Then last week we had quite an amazing presentation from Máire Donnelly, and one thing that stood in my mind was the capacity with regard to offshore wind and the facility that's down in Oporto off Portugal. It's a floating device, you know, and again, you know, we have, by all accounts from everyone we hear about, tremendous capacity in Ireland as an island nation with the sea around us and everything, to be really quite, to my mind, we should be very ambitious in this field, because, you know, if we get it right, not only do we mitigate, but also we could be supplying the rest of Europe, in fact. So I have a number of questions with regard to realistic projections for future development of renewable energy for the next 2 decades in Ireland. What do you think is a realistic projection? And what source of energy do you think in renewable energy would be best for us to use here? With regard, I'm a member of the Green Party, and Deputy Ryan, my colleague, he introduced the Community Energy Bill into the into the Dáil in November. And the whole thing for the Green Party is community energy and community access to energy. So I'd like to ask you, where are we with regard to community cooperatives being able to generate and have access to the grid, so not only supply their own communities, but also in terms of access to the grid, so that they can generate funding for the community, and it can stay in the community in and around rural Ireland and around the country in general. And there is definitely a problem. I speak to farmers fairly regularly around the southeast of Ireland. I'm from Waterford, and there's definitely there's a blockage in terms of access to the grid. So it's seen they cannot access the grid, so I'm just curious, like with regard to a farmer, you know, someone would say something 25 acres of land. If they were to put that under solar PVs, like what do you think? What would that deliver for them within their farm, but also in terms of into the community, like in terms of earnings? What could a farmer, 25 acres of land, what could they earn? Because farmers are under pressure and they need to have other sources of income. With new technologies such as ocean and tidal, do you see them playing a bigger role into the next, say, 20 years or so? And what problems do you see they will have with regard to access to the grid? Carbon pricing, Mr. Griffin, you mentioned that the update to the National Mitigation Plan, it'll be updated with carbon pricing measures through the emissions trading scheme for power generation. Can you clarify what you mean by this? Are changes foreseen to the ETS, such as measures to increase the permit price, or will it continue to be business as usual there? With regard to Money Point, I have a few questions here. You mentioned Money Point previously and plans to close it around 2025. Where are we at with those plans? What provision has been made for the staff that was already asked earlier? And with regard to biomass, can you assure me that biomass will not play a significant role in the 55% renewable energy target for 2030? Where
them first.
Yeah, sorry, I have several more.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'll take some of these and I'll ask colleagues to come in on them. The first point that you mentioned about the role of the committee in the development of the NECP, as I read it, it's very clearly stitched into your terms of reference that you really have an important role here, and that I would expect to see. It all depends, I suppose, on the timing when the committee are due to report. That there will clearly be views expressed based on what you've heard and your own opinions about, potentially new measures that might be inserted into in the NECP, or things that would absolutely need to be looked at. So I think the suite of hearings that you've already had and more to come, I think, will place you in a strong position to offer opinions on a lot of stuff that might feature in the NECP. So I think it will be important that at a point in time, and maybe it will be the report itself, that we will consider that as part of an input to the NECP, because it's a de facto consultation. Just on your point on offshore energy, and apologies to the Chair because you raised that yourself in your opening remarks. So will offshore wind play a role? I think the short answer is yes. I think the more complicated thing is when. And we prepared an offshore renewable energy development plan in 2014. It set out there was potential about 4,500 megawatts of offshore wind and about 1,500 megawatts of wave and tidal. Now, the wave and tidal, as you know, is further down the road and requires a significant degree of further research and development, some of which we're funding ourselves in the department. The offshore energy technologies are well developed. Michael had an opportunity in the last couple of weeks to go over and visit a fixed offshore wind scheme that has been run by SSE and Wick, I think it was, off the coast of Scotland, the far north. And Statoil, I think, I don't know whether it's completed yet, but they have some demonstration turbines up on the 6 demonstration turbines up of the floating technology. Like, one of the challenges we face when we're looking at the next RES is that trade-off between what's the most cost-effective technology and developing a diverse pool, because we will need to do that. If you look at the figures, it's quite clear that onshore wind is still the cheapest when you look at the cost per megawatt hour in 2017 prices. Large offshore wind, large onshore wind, I beg your pardon, about €89. Large offshore wind, about 129. So we have to balance that need to diversify the portfolio with the impact on the consumer. We expect that over a relatively short number of years that the costs will come down. We're seeing very, very substantial reductions occur in solar, for example, over the last few years. And we do believe that offshore wind is likely to form a considerable component of the renewable energy portfolio looking forward maybe 5, 10, 15 years. And as you say, there is huge potential. I mean, if you look at Ireland's offshore, 900,000 square kilometres, 10 times the size of our island landmass, massive potential there. And all of these things are knitted in to have significant levels of offshore wind, and it's unfortunate EirGrid aren't with us today, but you probably require a fairly fundamental redesign of the grid. Do you run across country? Do you run it offshore? Are we generating offshore wind solely for our own consumption, or should we be looking at export? And what does that mean in terms of the volume of offshore wind you would want to bring onto the system, and how you structure the grid then to maybe sell it into other administrations? The community energy and access and the costs of that, I'll ask Michael maybe to take some of that, and there may be views from our colleagues in SCAI on that particular issue. Money Point, I think I'll ask ESB to talk about that because they are doing a lot of work on that issue quite clearly. And then there is the ETS. I mean, there was a review of the ETS undertaken as part of the climate suite over the last year or 18 months. That review has been completed. It has done a number of things, and I'll ask Frank Maughan to come in on that. So maybe we'll take Michael first, Frank, and then I'll ask ESB to talk about Money Point.
Senator, thank you. I talked a little bit about the community piece at micro and scale level. On the question of grade, the Commission for Regulation of Utilities has recently published ECP1, Enduring Connection Policy 1. I think the important character there is the 1. That's focused very much on the near term and 2020 targets. But the question of our future approach to how we allocate grade and how we deal with the community group and how we diversify across sectors will be key. There's a massive amount of solar out there which wants to bid into the system, indeed more than we could ever take. It also would be highly peak. It would not be dispatchable 24/7, 365 days a year. So it would be, we will get a better sense from the first res auction of where solar is at in terms of the price mix. I think just to pick up that point, the Secretary General, we have to balance all of the participation with keeping the system stable and functioning, but also keeping it price competitive. And the offshore is quite expensive. About 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, the UK commissioned its largest offshore wind farm, and that's coming in at 140 to 150 pounds sterling per megawatt hour. That is a staggering number. While there are all kinds of promises coming forward of reductions and falling prices, at the moment we haven't seen that. We haven't seen those numbers come into the market. But the UK prices are steep. So I'm not sure I'm giving you a full answer to it, saying we have to, we will have to, sorry, the Commission for Regulation of Utilities would have to look at how it revises the grid access policy so that we do deal with the smaller, more community-based developer. But again, question will arise, what is community? If I'm a farmer with 30 acres and I decide I want to come out in my community, or is it a group of people coming together in an area and aggregating what they can bring to the system?
Well, that's my question to you. I mean, what are you doing to support cooperatives with regard to energy?
There's quite a lot happening in SCI. I can take this a little bit further, but we already have the Sustainable Energy Communities, over 200, and of those 55 are developing pretty large macro plans looking at all the things they can do, including generation, including efficiency, including management and self-consumption. The target, I think, of SCI is to grow that to 500, and in many ways it's taking the Tipperary energy model and growing it out across, because one of the key things communities are going to need are trusted intermediaries, people who they can go to, who they can talk with authority in terms of energy issues and give advice. But then that'll have to be paid for. So how do we structure that into the system that pays for all of the energy costs?
Another speaker wants to come in after. Sorry. Frank Maughan.
Thank you, Chair. So just on carbon pricing, I understand the Senator's question was put in the context of the NMP and what we say in the mitigation plan. I suppose it was a reaffirmation of government's commitment to carbon pricing as a core policy measure within climate policy. Now, there's effectively two sides to carbon pricing. There's the emissions trading scheme, which is an EU-level measure, and then separately there's carbon tax, which is a national domestic measure in the rest of the economy. So on the ETS, as the Secretary-General has mentioned, it's recently gone through a reform at EU level. A new directive was put in place earlier this year. Member States have a number of months, I think until autumn of next year, to transpose that into domestic legislation. But as was mentioned, that reform is already starting to see some impact on prices within the ETS. So the participants in the scheme are starting to sort of look towards the constraints that they will face over the next decade, and that's actually starting to push up prices, which from a climate point of view is a positive, I suppose, movement. Overall, at EU level, the directive requires the ETS sector, if I can call it that, to reduce emissions by 43% on 2005 levels by 2030. So it's quite a steep ambition, a steep curve that the sector as a whole has to achieve between now and 2030. There's a separate, I suppose, commitment or measure in relation to carbon tax, which is a domestic measure, and I think the committee has already heard evidence on this from both the Advisory Council and separately from the SRI, where the SRI has mentioned that it's done work for the Department of Finance over the last year on foot of a commitment in the mitigation plan to look at the potential impacts on increasing carbon tax. Now, clearly the outcome of that work is a question for the budget, and so we're not in a position to sort of say anything on that today. It's a matter for the Minister for Finance, but that's giving effect to the mitigation plan commitment which was taken up by the Department of Finance when we published the plan last year.
Did the ESB want to come in on some of those?
Please, yes. I might just mention, first of all, Senator, the connection question, and as Michael said, the enduring connection policy is in place. My understanding on that is that it was open for a period of a month, and there was several gigawatts of new plants sought to connect in that period across a couple of hundred applications. So I suppose the issue really is, grid capacity is a scarce capacity, and that's why there will be difficulties in different areas. From the ESB perspective, we try to sort of lead the demand if we can to some extent and build out capacity in advance of the requirement. But there will always be difficult points where more people want onto the grid system at any particular point than is available. But that is for the system operators in ESB networks and more so in EirGrid to decide on a very objective basis how they allocate that capacity.
Just on that, I think we as a committee should ask EirGrid for a note on this in relation to taking offshore and microgeneration, putting that onto the grid. So we'll do that in writing and maybe ask them in if necessary. Sorry to interrupt you.
In relation to money point, it's a complex question. Look, at the context is clear. Money point will transition away from coal by 2025. That's policy, and that's what we're working towards. It's complex because Money Point, it's the largest store of energy on this island. Money Point, the site can hold 3 months of energy on the island, and it's by a long shot the largest store of energy. So if there's to be a disruption in gas or anything like that, well then Money Point would be hugely valuable. So we just need to factor that into our thinking in terms of the exact timing of it coming off the system. It also is capable of providing 20% of our total demand. But I suppose even more importantly, as a synchronous plant on the system, i.e. a plant which is synchronised with the frequency of the transmission system, it's very important in terms of acting as a counterbalance for the amount of intermittent power on the system. So you can't run the system 100% on wind. You need some of this, what we call inertia on the system from big power plants. That's the technology as it exists right now. That might change in years to come. So it's a complex question as to when it comes off and how you choose the best time for it to come off. But the context of it is 2025 to transition away from coal. And I suppose when we look then at the options around that, you have options around maintaining a coal capability in the event that it might be needed, but not plan to run it. Right? That's one option. It's not a great option, but it's an option. But there are the options we're looking at are: would we put gas into the plant, replace with gas plants? Would we look at a biomass plant? The biggest coal plant in Great Britain, Drax, has converted to biomass. There are lots of issues with that. Or would we look to put wind either onshore or offshore on the site? And we're working through all those options now, and we're talking to people down the site. But it's not an easy question to address. And I suppose what sort of the oversight of it all is, we're now entering into a new market structure on the 1st of October. The ISEM market goes live between Ireland and Great Britain from the 1st of October. And that market, the first question we've got to ask, or that all market participants, not just the ESB, will be asking is, what is the need for new plant in that market? So is there a need for a new plant? And then what then do you do with Money Point in that context? So they're the things that we're considering right now. It's not a simple question, but it's something we've got a period now to sort of make sure we get right, because I think it's of huge importance to Ireland as well as to ESB.
Thank you. And I might move on to Senator Ian Marshall. Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, gents, for your presentations. Thoroughly enjoyable. And like some of my colleagues, I just referenced Máire Donnelly's presentation last week, which was really informative and certainly worth watching that one back. Mark, with regard to your own information, obviously it's not going to be one solution that solves these problems for us. It's a combination of things, and it's a case of trying to prioritise and put your money where its wisest investment is. And it's an approach I think of obviously carrot on stick. You mentioned, I was going to ask a question, but you actually touched on it briefly, was the investment in R&D into wave technology. tidal technology. I know that we live on an island, and maybe it's something that isn't researched and invested heavily in other parts of the world because they haven't got the access to tidal currents the way we have. So just a question on that. I think, Peter, with reference to the ESB presentation, and you made a point about close to a third of emissions are from agriculture, and agriculture, agri-food is something that's very close to my heart. I think the first thing that I would like to say is we've got to identify that as much as agriculture is one of the villains of the piece, it's one of the few industries that can be part of the solution to the problem. And its ability to sequester carbon, I think, is something that's often overlooked. Windmills can't sequester carbon, solar panels can't do this, other things can't do it, but agriculture can. The question I want to ask was, with reference specifically to biomass, I know we've probably difference of opinion on biomass, but there was a reference made to the nature of farm businesses, small, isolated individual SMEs. Has there been enough work done on the potential of biomass, remembering and bearing in mind we live in a temperate climate with access to water, we have ability to grow biomass, and I think that, you know, we're well positioned to grow the feedstock. It can often give an alternative income source for a small farm business. And we're certainly well placed to do that. And I think that sometimes it's overlooked. If we consider things that we're now doing work and looking at products like, for example, hemp, that will produce oil, protein, fibre. We're looking at biopolymers from hemp. You know, it can bioremediation of soil, decontamination of soil. All of these things, and moreover, I think when you look at a small family farm that you give an alternative crop to grow, all of a sudden there's social goods that can provide is something we need to factor in. I think in closing on the agriculture point, I'm due to go to a meeting tonight which actually looks at the calculations around emissions from agriculture and have we got this calculation right? Because I think often it's very easy to jump at the easiest, look at the easiest fix. So if agriculture is a big offender, then, you know, legislate hard against them. I think, Tim, if we look at your piece, and 2 points, and I don't want to repeat or go over ground we've already covered, but, you know, obviously the community ownership is key. We are lagging light years behind our European counterparts in initiatives that will encourage SME businesses to generate power and sell power to their neighbours or adjacent businesses is something I've always shouted about, and I'm encouraged that Europe now have referenced this and are making a point about this. And how do we catalyse that? Because I think there's probably a collegiate spirit out there. We just need to put things in place that will make this happen. With reference to the electric vehicles, and I think that, you know, we all see it when you live in a rural environment where actually you haven't got access to charging points. It's a big problem, and the one problem you're going to encounter is as uptake increases for electric vehicles, the first thing that will kill it dead in the water will be access to charging points. And it's well and good when you're Dublin based in your life or your work, but when you go rural and you've got large distances to cover, access to charging points and enough charging points is key. And I've seen a situation in the last few days where we've had a charging point and 2 or 3 vehicles waiting to be charged. So that in itself, if we don't provide the charging points, that will kill the industry off. Just in conclusion, you know, I think it's honourable, it's credible that the intention is to get out of peat by 2030 and out of coal by 2025. I think the Board and Mona ambition of 75% renewables by 2024 is credible. However, I'm really genuinely concerned about the commitment to deal with the problem of 4,000 people in the Midlands whose lives will be adversely affected by this. The businesses, the families and all that currently derive their income from peat and that industry. I'd be interested to learn more about what the transition looks like, what the alternative business propositions for these people are. It's one thing to say a transition and a cessation of burning peat, but we'll have a responsibility to actually give these people alternatives and a long-term vision or strategy for a different business. Thanks, Chair.
Well, I start with Mr. Halpin just to come in on those questions.
I'm happy enough to pick up on the community energy. First of all, Michael Manley has already addressed much of it, but through our network of 200 member communities in our community energy network, we are funding energy master plans which are looking at the options. And renewable energy isn't for all. It's about efficiency first and renewables, and it's looking at the makeup of communities and what their particular energy needs are. But also through our smart grid programme, we're funding research into the development of microgrids, which looks at the complexities, the legal, the technical, the economic, all aspects of what it is to have many microgenerators in one area feeding into the needs in that area. So that is being considered, but that supplements what Michael Manley said earlier. With respect to EVs, your observation is absolutely right that in some respects EVs aren't for everyone, and they are certainly more suited to an urban driver than they are a rural driver, and that's mostly related to the limitations of the range of the batteries. Having said that, and I'm picking up maybe on Senator O'Sullivan's analogy to the mobile phone, EVs too bring with them the change in culture. That is that we see that most EV charging will be done at night in the driveway. So actually rural dwellers have a better advantage than many urban dwellers who are living in terraced houses, etc. And SEAI is providing a grant not only for new EV purchases, but we're also providing grants for home charge points, both for new and second-hand purchasers. And this means that people will be able to charge their cars at home at night while the car is idle, giving them a perfectly adequate charge. And with most new vehicles now, the range is heading towards 200, 250 kilometres real use. It might profess otherwise on the data sheet. And so while they are not compatible with everyone's life at the moment, they're increasingly compatible. The matters of, we acknowledge in the note that we provided to the committee though, that there is, as the demand for EVs grows, and there has been a doubling in EV sales so far this year, as demand grows, the infrastructure will have to meet that demand. And again, much like the telephone networks, it will be an iterative process, but we see advances all the time.
And then will I bring in Mr. Griffin to answer? So
maybe just to continue on the EV theme that SEAI have started the discussion on. We have a low emissions vehicle task force in place, and they've already done a very considerable amount of work on that particular area. And there are a range of supports in place that you're probably familiar with, but I mean VRT relief of 5,000, purchase grant of 5,000 for EVs, a new grant that we introduced at the start of the year, €600 to support installation of a home charger, benefit in kind rate of 0% for battery electric vehicles, low motor tax rate, a grant up to 7,000 support the use of electric vehicles, which actually has been taken up by a number of taxi, hackney and limousine operators, and a discount on tolls of 50% for BEVs and 25% for PHEVs. So there's a huge amount of work ongoing in that space, and we're very conscious that to move from a situation where you have 6,000 EVs on the road at this stage to 500,000 on the road by 2030 is going to require a further major transformation. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done by the group on looking at issues like the building regulations, look at issues like the planning regulations. How, for example, can you attach an EV charging point to some of the street lighting and all that kind of stuff. So there's a huge amount of work ongoing. On the home charger grant, just to reflect the sort of enthusiasm that there is since the scheme introduced, we've approved 740, payment pending on 209 and paid 498, so about 1,500 on a scheme that was introduced probably in January or February of this year. We've paid out 21 grants to the NTA for use of electric vehicles in the taxi, hackney and limousine sector. But your point is right. I mean, the charging infrastructure is absolutely critical on this, and We understand that there's a decision that has issued or is likely to issue from the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities that will confirm in more detail the role of ESB in relation to the existing e-cars infrastructure and give them more clarity in relation to how they manage a programme of scale on EV charging. One of the things that we've included in the 500 million Climate Action Fund is for organisations to bid in for EV charging infrastructure, and we expect in the first tranche of that we will have a number of asks in that regard. Going back to the first point that you raised, Senator, on R&D. We've invested about 31 million in R&D in the ocean sector since 2013, and that has funded a number of schemes in Mayo, Galway and Cork, like the Galway Bay test site, like the Atlantic Marine Renewable Energy test site in Mayo, and then the tank scale site in Cork. So we have about a further 4.75 million to be spent on ocean energy research in 2018. And if you broaden it out into the research programmes more generally, like there's a lot of research done by SEAI, say on the prototype development scheme. There's a new behavioural economics unit in place in the SEAI, which will be really, really important, I think, in terms of creating that shift and dealing with some of the inertia that exists out there in terms of moving to some of these new technologies. We have an internal energy research budget ourselves, and the EPA, we fund a very substantial research programme for the EPA. So we're not short of money, and I think we remain very committed to ensuring that we're at the cutting edge, and indeed we work very, very closely with academic institutions on the research agenda generally. On Bord na Móna and the just transition, I know for a fact that the new chair and CEO are acutely conscious of this, and that they either have or will shortly bring to the board a proposal for what Bord na Móna might look like in 2030 when they're shifting out of the peat business over the next number of years. And given that they're in and Tom Donlan, the CEO, if he's looking at this, probably won't thank me for saying it, but they are usually involved in that process. And again, in terms of an organisation that will be very deeply affected by that carbon transition, it may be no harm to ask them in for a chat and just see what they're doing, because there's a lot of creative thinking about how they can harness their own natural resources and use people who have for generations been involved in energy in the Midlands to see how the organisation might look in the next decade post a transition to a lower carbon Bord na Móna. On the biomass issue, Bord na Móna, for example, are very involved in seeing how to increase the indigenous biomass supply, and they're looking at things like agri-crops, principally willow, forestry byproducts, including thinnings, brash, pulpwood as the main sources of biomass material. But I think and all the biomass they use is fully in compliance with EU sustainability standards. I think the pressure remains, though, to get the supply chain right and how you build a domestic biomass capacity to ensure that in time you're not reliant on imports, because, I mean, the imports themselves have a carbon impact. So they're looking at a whole suite of issues. We have our own bioenergy plan, which I know Deputy Ryan and Deputy Martin had a number of PQs on down to us in the last couple of days as to where we stand on that. I mean, our view is that, and Mike will talk a bit about this, there have been a number of very significant developments on the biomass and bioenergy front since that plan was originally conceived. And we wanted to ensure that the plan that emerges ultimately, which will have to be part of the feed into the National Energy and Climate Plan, makes sense. Another big thing that's happening on the biomass and the renewable heat and so on is the sustainable, the SSRH scheme for, what do we call it now?
Support scheme for renewable heat.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's been through a number of iterations, but that's a big one for us. We've committed to spending 300 million on that over the course of the National Development Plan. We've got government approval to it now, and we've published the first part of that, which is a grant scheme, at the start of September. Yeah.
Peter O'Shea, if you want to.
Just briefly on electrification of transport. The ESP eCars business is the business unit within the ESP that's responsible for operating, developing and rolling out the eCar charging network. And like their own analysis from operating that network for the last number of years would indicate that the vast majority of charging for electric vehicles will be done at home rather than in public charging points. However, I think there's a really big caveat around that. In order to build confidence amongst the public that they won't get caught with range anxiety, we actually need to have that charging network. And it sort of goes back to the question from the Chair at the very outset, because a lot of these chargers, they're required to be there, but they might not be used on a 100% basis. So that's just an add-on to that. In terms of biomass and biofuels generally, like we would see biofuels as having an important part to play within the energy mix in Ireland in years to come. Whether that's biogas or biomass, and both would have, attractions for the agricultural sector in terms of developing it. The one thing I would say about biofuels is when you see the word bio, it's going to be scarce, because it's developed because of development around it. But one positive thing from Europe with the new renewable package is that there have been questions and concerns over whether biomass is genuinely renewable or not. And the latest directives in Europe put very strict sustainability criteria against biomass if you want to ensure that it's really genuinely renewable. So, we would see biomass and biogas as being part of the energy mix into the future.
I'll now bring in Deputy Stanley.
Thanks, Chair, and I want to welcome the guests here from DSB, the Department, and indeed SEAI. Mark, from the Department, you mentioned that communities have to be at the heart of it, and I'd have to say to you that, coming from the Midlands, that the approach of government and indeed the corporations driving on the wind farm industry, and we need to use we should be using wind, but we need to use it responsibly. What's happened is, in fact, the opposite's been the case. The Department's approach has been the complete opposite. You have failed to date to bring forward, you and the Minister, to bring forward even guidelines in terms of wind farms and in terms of having any kind of regulatory framework in place for the locating of wind farms. And meanwhile, what you've done is you've allowed the wind farm industry and the wind farm developers to steamroll over communities and to drop huge turbines up to 170 metres in height right around counties like Laois and Offaly. Now, I welcome the fact from what you're saying today that communities are going to be at the heart of it. So if we're going to stop at this point and we're going to change that, that's good news, and I'll go to here happy this evening, and perhaps you might just elaborate on that for me. In relation to the Midlands and the just transmission, as a former employee of Pordenona and the ESB, I have a particular interest in this one, and obviously a lot of workers in my constituency are working in both companies. And to date, I don't see, and I have a real genuine concern about this, that I don't see the plan in place. I don't see the shape of a plan in place, even in terms of what happens after 2030. Now, we're up against 2019, and don't take it personal what I said to you about that thing about the business with the wind farm guidelines, but the Department has failed. And 4 ministers, I think around the 5th minister, has failed to do it. Whether it's the politicians, whether it's the ministers are failing, or whether it's civil servants or a combination of both. Perhaps you might tell me why we cannot have wind farm guidelines. My own opinion is we haven't got them because you want to allow, or somebody wants to allow, the wind farm developers to have the wind farms in place and sure, close the door when the horse is bolted is all no good, because that's what it looks like, and that's what communities are taking from it. That's what county councillors are taking from it, not just county councillors from the party that I represent, Sinn Féin, but indeed county councillors from all parties in affected areas. In relation to the peat and 2030, I don't see the shape of it. I pass the power station in Neatonderry nearly on a weekly basis. West Offaly, Ferban, Lanesborough, same. those power stations are, there is no plan that I see coming in relation to creating a biomass industry around those. And there is limitations, you said about bioscarce, and we have to be careful with bio. But we have another bio, we do have potential for biogas, and the ESB have mentioned that, and I understand that the ESB is starting to look seriously at this option now, because we have a huge agricultural sector, and that's no bad thing, but we have a huge amount of agricultural waste, and we have a problem with agricultural waste. And I firmly believe, and talking to people who have developed these plants, and particularly the one in Nurney, that we have an opportunity here for jobs, we have an opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have an opportunity here to get money into rural communities. I believe that this can be a win-win-win if we develop the biogas industry. But to go back to the power stations and the transition, if you take the Willow scheme wasn't a success. We accept that. There's a lot of marginal land in areas around these power stations. If you take North Offaly, for example, huge amount of marginal land around those. What trials are being done? And I've heard people talking in this room and in other rooms about, we'll retrain people to work in other parts of the energy sector. But somebody who's 45 or 50 years of age, who's been driving the tractor on Board Namona for the last 20 years, may not be up for being reskilled to, to doing retrofitting on housing schemes or something like that. It may not be easy to do that. And I just think the feel I have of it, and I asked Board Namona the same questions, is that it's not happening. And it's not happening at a sufficient speed. In relation to the EVs, the concern here is that, and it's been touched on here to some extent, is that, range anxiety, for those of us who live in rural areas, at this point, the electric car isn't really the option. And the other thing is that I wouldn't feel that happy plugging in my electric car at night if I knew that the energy going into it was brought in through the interconnector from Britain. Now, I'm not arguing against an interconnector, and it's generated by nuclear power, or indeed generated, if it's generated by coal from Moneypoint, could actually make things worse. So, I mean, we have to, there's a number of parts to this puzzle. If we simply think, we're all driving to work in nice, clean electric cars, and we can get our photographs taken with them and say how great we are. But the facts is that if the power that's going into that battery is being generated by dirty coal or nuclear power, we shouldn't be smiling at all. So we have to, and I'd ask you just to address that in terms of that transition. But in reality, the huge concern as well is that the network isn't there at the moment. Your company has provided it free of charge, and that can't continue because you're a commercial semi-state, right? So where is the plan for where is the plan, and SEAI and the department might address this, where is the plan for a comprehensive EV charging system throughout the state? We need that if we're going to do it. And I'm nearly there. It's better maybe that I'll finish because I'm 2/3 of the way there, Cahill. Thanks. In relation to schools and farm buildings, I went down 3 years ago, myself and my parliamentary assistant decided one day during the summer holidays that we go down to look at Templederry at the wind farms down there, and that's a cooperative model, as you know, down in Tipperary. And on the way there, one of the things we noticed in the valley driving along, there was a huge agricultural shed being put up, covering about 1.5 acres, south facing. And I remember saying to him, I stopped the car, and I remember saying to him, isn't that a great opportunity for a solar panel? And the department is given a grant, not your department, Mark, but another department is given a grant for that shed. And that's fine, no problem with that, right? And new schools have gone up in the constituency that I'm in. One of the good things that's happened, and I've given the government credit for it as an opposition TD, is we've had a whole string of new schools. We've new schools all over the place, right? Nearly every school in Portage is new at the moment. There's only a couple more to go. And an awful lot of them, all of them have flat roofs on them. One, Bríd, opened recently, huge south-facing roofs on them. There's a whole selection of them right across the constituency over the last 10 years. And not one has a solar panel on it. And where is the joined up thinking from government? Is it that the ministers are not knocking their heads together is that the Secretary-Generals of the Department is not talking to each other. You know, what's happening? Why can't we? And I've heard this explanation before about that. Oh, you know, we'd be generating power when it's not needed. Well, I can tell you that you go into any school from this month on, any school over the next 6 months, over the winter and into the spring, and you need heating in them. And if there's a spillover during the summer, we can just turn it off. There's solar panels on buildings in India and Spain. When the sun is beaming it, blasting it out of it, 40 degrees and 45 degrees, they're able to manage that. And they're able to manage it when they want it, to use it to heat water, to use it to do other things during the day. You know, we can bank that power can be banked in other ways. If they can do it in those countries where it's about twice or 3 times as hot as it is here, surely to God we can do it here where we have a very moderate climate. So I don't buy that excuse. But why, and oh why, are we not putting solar panels on those schools? We met the IFA today. All of the deputies here nearly would have been over to have their annual lobby. They've raised this issue for the first time ever on the short list of requests that to put the TDs at budget time, because they have a long list as well, a very long one, but they also have a short one. And on the short list to have support for renewable energy this time around, right? So they have moved to that point now, and that's a step in the right direction. But what's happening at department level and what's happening at sustainable energy level, and the ESB as well just might address that issue around the charging points. Thanks, Carola.
So, Mark, do you want to come in first?
So thanks, Deputy Stanley. Just to react to the frustration that is obviously there for you in relation to the wind energy guidelines, and I can understand. I can understand it completely.
It couldn't happen anyway.
Yeah, no, I can understand it completely. No. And you know, we've been involved in this and trying to come to a resolution for a long time. It was again stitched into the programme for government in 2016 and commitments that it would be delivered. What we have and what we have agreed, and I think was published in June of last year, is a new approach in terms of wind energy development. So that would involve a more stringent noise limit consistent with World Health Organization standards. And with that, we'd have a new robust noise monitoring regime to ensure compliance with the standards. We've moved from, or we will be moving from, a guideline setback distance of 500 metres to a visual amenity setback of 4 times the turbine height between a wind turbine and the nearest residential property, subject to a mandatory minimum. So you move from a guideline to a mandatory. The elimination of shadow flicker, and the introduction of new obligations in relation to engagement with local communities in relation to the provision of community benefit. The difficulty which we experienced once that position was arrived at, and which hadn't been provided for, and I mean that was the hard part, getting to a point where we believe we have a suite of measures in place that will address the concerns that local communities expressed around shadow flicker, around noise, around setback and amenity impact. There was a European Court of Justice decision while this work was ongoing, which effectively said, and we hadn't anticipated that this would be required, that an SEA, Strategic Environmental Assessment, would be required for the amendments to the 2006 guidelines. And that work we expect will be completed in 2019. The new guidelines will be in place at that point. I can assure you categorically that there was no conspiracy on the part of the department or on the minister, because you know there are many things that the minister expresses frustration over with officials in the department. This is one he comes back to time and time again, because he struggles to understand why it has taken so long now that we've reached something that we believe will work and will allay the concerns of local communities. So the commitment to the model is there, and the next part is to complete the SEA process, which is being conducted by the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, who have responsibility for the wind energy guidelines, and they're moving that through the system as quickly as they possibly can. Now, the advantage of an SEA process is you're going out again to the public to give them a chance to to input into it, but I absolutely appreciate and fully accept the frustration that you're experiencing, because we know it is an issue for local communities around the country. And again, just to reiterate, there's no attempt on our part to make this process any longer or any more onerous than it has been so far. On the transition, the Loughree, West Offaly, Eden, Derry, I know from conversations, as I said, with the Chair and the CEO, that they are working very, very hard on trying to come up with a model for the company that will work post-2030, and as you point out, takes account of the fact that there are people, as you described it, that drive a truck that don't necessarily want to or are in a position to be retrained. So there's a huge amount of work that has already been done. I'm not clear what where they're at in terms of the internal processes in Board Namona, whether they've briefed the board, whether they've briefed staff. But as I said to the Chair, it may be no harm in, because when you talk about the just transition, this is an area that is deeply affected. When you look at, the Midlands in terms of economic development, the importance of the company to the entire region, and it's an important issue, and you'll have a clear example of an organisation that's thinking very, very hard about how they affect the just transition and what other areas, what areas they're currently involved in that they can expand that are not sort of peat or carbon related, and what new things they may be in a position to do using the natural resources that are already there. EVs, yeah.
Will I bring in ESB on that? The EVs, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, your question, Deputy, about the electricity being used to power the battery in the EV. I did some numbers last year, and I've shared them to a number of people. I'm happy to share them with the committee as well, around with the existing electricity mix of 27% renewable power in our mix, and assuming the rest is a mix of gas and coal, how efficient is it to drive an electric vehicle carbon-wise compared to an internal combustion engine? And the numbers show that it's almost twice as efficient in the amount of carbon you produce per kilometre driving an electric vehicle as driving an internal combustion engine. And of course that's at a 27% renewable mix in our electricity system. So as that 27% grows to 40% by 2020, that ratio becomes even better. And as we move then towards a fully decarbonised electricity system, the ratio just falls away because it is fully decarbonised. And the same numbers, just in passing, the same numbers apply to electric heating. So if you install a heat pump, it's not quite twice as efficient carbon-wise, but it's just short of it. So even with the existing electricity mix, and there's a whole range of reasons behind that, but I think it's important just to reflect on that. The actual power that's going into the batteries or into the heat pump with the current mix of electricity makes it a much more efficient carbon answer than the existing fossil fuel alternative.
In the SCAI, Mr. Halpin.
Okay, and picking up on Peter O'Shea's remarks there, we on the SCAI website, we have a calculator to allow potential purchasers of electric vehicles to actually do a comparison for a typical range of 16,000 kilometres driving. Now that might well be substantially more when driven in a rural environment, but it is, as Peter O'Shea said, a substantial saving on energy, and that's allowing for the current electricity mix, and as that improves. As regards the solar panels on schools, you dismiss the occupancy issue, but that is a fact of schools. Schools have high occupancy from September through to May and possibly into June timeframe. During July and August they are at virtually zero occupancy, and many schools, not always, but many schools have no occupancy at night.
But PV works during this time of year as well.
It does work.
PV works, not as efficiently,
yeah,
but it does work.
But it still is if it is generating too much electricity and then it is not being used at night, that's the issue, is that it may actually be generating too much, more than it can be used.
But it can be used for other things, though. It can be used for, other countries do it. Spain, India, a lot of other countries do it.
And that's part of the PV pilot that we're supporting for homes, is looking at how to use technology to make better use of PV when it's available. Separate to that, the building regulations are shortly subject to revision, and they bring in the concept of near zero energy buildings formally in as part of the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive. And this introduces the concept of cost optimality, which is where you do a full cost benefit analysis on what is the best technologies to bring you to virtually zero energy use and zero carbon. And this results in certain prioritisation. And so in certain circumstances with buildings, depending on their use, and this applies not just to schools but to all commercial buildings, that they will be, the prioritisation will decide what is the best mix of technologies, along with how to make the building itself more efficient. With PV, more so probably than other technologies, it's possible to retrofit them relatively easily afterwards if the business case improves. But it's not always the case that it is commercially sensible to invest in PV for schools. And the Department of Education and Skills, no different to any other large property owner, has to make decisions in terms of how to use its budget sensibly.
Could I ask about the biogas and farm buildings?
For the SEAI?
Yes, and the department.
Just repeat your question, sorry, Deputy.
Yes, just the situation as regards, we give grants for farm buildings. Farmers want to get into, increased numbers of farmers want another stream of income. They also want, a lot of them now want to play their part in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. They're users of power. If they could erect solar panels on some of their farm buildings, it would be a help.
Could the SEI, have you or the department, or bring in my
The glib answer, Deputy, I don't mean it to be glib, is that if they want to put a solar panel on their roof of their farm buildings to generate power at the moment, they can. I mean, there are planning requirements, but if someone wants to self-generate that... Well, there's no grant scheme for it, but it's a commercial enterprise, and no more than any other scheme on that. What's been sought, I think, is what's referred to as a tariff, which actually is a price. And it's a commercial price for electricity, and people, will be looking at it. They will need a support price. So that's something which we will see more of when we see the outcome of the next RES auction, and we see how solar bids into that, what's the shape of it, how much of it is going to be commercial and utility scale, and how much is going to be small scale. And that's going to fall too into the mix of, when I spoke earlier on, I spoke probably mostly about wind in the role of microgen and community, but solar will have a piece in there as well. So there's no one to stop anyone at the moment other than the planning regulations in terms of putting on your roof. But people want to have a capacity to spill that and sell it into the market, and that's going to be part of a big piece of market redesign, because our market currently is not designed or configured for that.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Deputy Pringle. I had a number of speakers here who cannot, at the moment, come forward. So I'm going to bring in Deputy Pringle, then Deputy Ryan, and then Deputy Deering, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Chairperson. And my questions have changed a wee bit through the progression of the day, so we'll just see how we get on with them. Mainly for the department and Mr. Griffin, if we could, you outlined there earlier in response to questions. I think the very first question, or just all the bodies that were available within the government already in terms of climate change and looking at climate change, and and basically I think the gist of what you were saying was that there's not really any need for an additional body, and so I just wondered if you could just outline how those committees that you have in government at the minute, how they actually can entice and mandate actual actions to take place, and also outline where their work is made available to the public, how that actually can be accessed as well from the public. And I'm not sure if it is available. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm not sure. But so just really what power that has and what it can do, if you could outline that. Also, I wonder if you could outline specifically what you're doing to bring Ireland's overall targets within the performance targets within the 2020 and 2030 targets. Just specifically what you're doing. Not we've heard a lot of talk around what the EU is doing and EU plans and everything coming into place and talking to the EU and that, but we haven't heard actually anything concrete, I don't think, in relation to what's actually happening. And I was just wondering then too, as the Department of Climate Change, what can you currently do to make the changes happen to legislation, for example, like the offshore wind possible? What can you actually do? I don't want to hear about what the Department of climate or whatever they are, the environment or whatever is doing. I want to know what you can do as climate change, because I think that's important. And also, just in your opening statement, you made a statement there that you said that the structure of Ireland's economy, with a dispersed population settlement, car-based commuting, and the central role of agriculture in the rural economy all require government to balance economic and social objectives with the imperative to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. I wonder if you could just actually outline that and expand on it and what it actually means, and and maybe if you talk about how you see rural Ireland as actually fitting into this climate change that you're talking about, because there's no mention of the rural Ireland at all in any of the outcomes. And just finally for the ESB, just this kind of has been answered already maybe, but I'm just wondering, you're saying that there's no barrier to connection of a single house with renewable grid to the grid, and then I think later on then you said that there was no tariff for that there, so I just wonder what the situation is, and if you could clarify that. And there was something else I had for you, but I can't remember.
You can come back in after.
Okay, thanks.
So will I let the department in? Mark Griffin, if you want to start.
So just to pick up your first point, Deputy Pringle, and when I describe the governance arrangements that currently exist, and your question in relation to how to mandate action, I suppose at the pyramid of all the top of the pyramid of all the things I've described is the government, and when you look at the arrangements that are in place, I mentioned a senior officials group on infrastructure and climate action. I mentioned a cabinet committee on infrastructure and climate action. I mentioned the high-level group that Minister Naughton chairs, which specifically monitors delivery of the National Mitigation Plan, looks at what's happening in the National Adaptation Framework, looks at progress being made on the 12 sectoral plans spread across several government departments, considers inputs from the Climate Change Advisory Council, would take inputs, and this is the government, from government departments at various stages in the year in terms of resource requirements for climate action. We would have fed obviously into the development of the National Development Plan, which sets out and has been approved by government as the key underpinning document for delivering a very substantial investment under the National Development Plan of about 22 billion rather on climate measures, and about 8.6 billion in sustainable development. We work very closely across government. I mean, there is the myth that has permeated that government departments operate in silos, but that's not the case at all. We work very closely with colleagues at all levels in our organisation, in our organisations, to make sure what the government commits to achieve under a programme for government or under a national plan or under a national mitigation plan, that they are all delivered. I struggle to see what a new or existing independent body would do over and above the structures that are there, that are clearly mandated by government and that we are accountable to government for delivering on.
Is there anywhere where we can actually see what that body deliberates on?
Well, I can provide an overview.
Is it routinely published what the body does?
The work of the body. I'm not sure. Does the? Sorry, you're right, Frank, and thanks for that. So what it is, the progress that has been made under the overarching governance frameworks is reported on by the sectoral ministers to the Oireachtas as part of the annual transition statement. Yes. So up until last year, the minister himself would have reported on the part of all government ministers, but all government ministers are now required, with responsibility for sectors, are required to report to the Oireachtas on an annual basis.
That's why I think it's needed. That answer you've outlined there, I think, shows why it's needed, because that's not clear, and you weren't even clear on it. So, I mean, we have to make this clear for everybody so that everybody can see it.
So I think in fairness to me, I was clear on about 90% of the components. The last bit my colleague was good enough to prompt me was on the ATS. So what we can do is set out for the committee what the governance structures are. And we'll make an assessment as to our view in relation to, and we have done in relation to how that covers off the basis that was in the first recommendation from the Citizens' Assembly. On the 2020 and 2030 targets, I mean, we have published our national mitigation plan. They set out 60 measures, 40 of them are already in place, a number of others are under development. We can provide you with a copy of that as well. I think it may be helpful. The National Development Plan, which is in the public domain, already sets out the range of climate and energy measures that will be delivered over the period of the NDP on energy efficiency, renewable energy, the transport sector, agriculture sector. All of that is there. On the foreshore consent process, again, this is not the foreshore consent process, but the legislation. Again, it's a function of government. I mean, government approved a general scheme of a bill. Government mandated to the Department of Housing to bring forward the legislation. I understand it was a subject of pre-ledge scrutiny in the Oireachtas at some point. And we are in dialogue with that department about progressing the bill to the next stages. We're also a member of the Marine Planning Group that is chaired with Minister Bríd, which looks at the general issue of how our marine sector can contribute to Ireland's economic development, and the MAFA bill is a point of discussion at that committee from time to time, and we input to that process as well. Sorry, the final point, I mean, in terms of specifically on 2020 and 2030, all of this in terms of what we need to do to meet the various targets and how we're going to do it, which will build on the National Mitigation Plan, the National Development Plan, will be set out in the National Energy and Climate Plan to be finalised by the end of next year.
Did you want to come in on that before I go to the ESB?
Yeah, well, there's one other point as well for the department, just in relation to that. This offshore wind issue has been ongoing since I think about 2014, and the legislation needs to be updated and everything like that there. I mean, do you see, as the Department of Climate Change, do you see that as a problem in actually dealing with issues around climate change and that we're now in 2018? So, I mean, we're 4 or 5 years down the line, and it's going to be another couple of years before this is going to be dealt with. And do you see that as an issue? I'm not asking you to call your colleagues in the department or whatever into dispute or anything, but I'm just asking you, do you see that as a problem?
Not in the immediate term, because in the earlier discussion we were saying offshore wind of scale outside the foreshore limits is likely to materialise in a number of years at that point, and we've had that discussion most recently, in fact, with the Department of Housing about what are the things that we need to do to drive this legislation to a conclusion.
The reason it's so many years off is because this hasn't been done.
No, that's not the reason. The reason
there's absolutely no barrier for it.
The reason it is a number of years off is more to do with the cost of the technology rather than whether a consenting process is in place or not. There are a number of schemes that are already consented. They have got consents under existing foreshore legislation. There is nothing to prevent them from a consenting process moving forward. But I pointed out earlier that there is still a very significant difference between the cost of the megawatt hour support that is required for onshore wind as compared to offshore wind, but we expect that to converge somewhat over the next number of years.
So,
I'm just conscious.
I want to question about rural Ireland.
Yeah, okay, very briefly. I'm just conscious that I've skipped the order of people because more have joined us because you were here from the very beginning. I kind of skipped one or two people who were before you, but I'm just conscious of getting your questions answered. So briefly, if you could come in on that, or I can bring you in a few moments if you want.
Yeah, well, I suppose the narrative around rural Ireland, and it was mentioned earlier in maybe my presentation, and certainly the ESB's, I think, like the structure of our system is very, very different to what you're seeing in the in other member states. I mean, if you look at Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions, about 28% of our emissions are from the emissions trading sector and about 72% from the non-ETS sector. You compare that to the rest of the EU, about 45% from the emissions trading sector and about 55% from the non-ETS. If you do a deeper dive then and you look at the non-ETS, which is the bit that we struggle most with, and you look at Ireland, about 46% of the emissions, and these are figures that I'm not 2015 figures, about 46% of the emissions from agriculture. On the EU 28, the non-ETS, about 18% of emissions from agriculture. So we have a very different challenge. We have a very different challenge to address in terms of how we deal with rural Ireland, how we deal with the agriculture sector, and how we deal with that sort of trade-off between addressing the climate challenges and the whole issue of food security, the impact on rural Ireland, the impact on jobs in rural Ireland, which is obviously something government has to reflect on.
I'm just going to look at BSB and for now, thank you. Just to answer your questions, Deputy.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy. Clarification is important here. The first element was the micro-generation, which are small generators, typically up to, say, 6 kilowatts on a single phase. And as I said earlier, that's around maybe 20 solar panels. And that falls under our scheme called Notify and Fit. So you have to notify ESB that you intend installing this. There will be a discussion with ESB and interaction, but the interaction is around standards and ensuring that the scheme is okay. It's not an interaction around whether the capacity is there typically to take that, right? So that's the first piece. The second piece then where there are scarce capacity is for larger wind farms or larger solar farms. And that goes through the standard enduring connection process that I mentioned earlier. And it's in that standard enduring connection process that there may be scarcity in terms of the capacity that's available on the system. We try to build out the system in advance to ensure the capacity is there, but in some circumstances, if you've got a number of generators looking to connect at a particular location, that capacity might be scarce. But that's typically when you're talking in megawatt numbers. So in the first scheme, you're talking in kilowatt numbers. In the second scheme, you're talking about megawatt numbers.
So in the first scheme, there's no barrier to...
You notify ESB through the ESB distribution code. There will be an interaction between ESB and the customer in relation to the standards, the type of equipment going on it, but there's no capacity constraint, if you like.
Right.
And that's typically how it works.
But there's no barrier to...
No.
And ESB will respond within a timely...
I'd imagine so. The actual detail of that I don't have here, but...
all right, okay.
Had you questions for the SEI Deputy?
No, I haven't. Sorry.
Thank you, Deputy. I will bring in Deputy Ryan next.
Question for the SEI. Jim, sure, you were in a commission, we were on the Climate Commission. You said that you're doing modelling work showing we're 50 million tonnes short in the 2030 target. Could you explain that? Have you any update on it?
Yeah, sure. So we ran a number of scenarios for consideration by the department, and we tend to model the existing range of policies and measures that are in place at different times for different scenarios. And we run a baseline scenario where we look at existing policies and measures up to the latest year where we have energy-related data, so 2017. We have an advanced scenario where we include the policies and measures that are included in the National Development Plan, the National Mitigation Plan, and at the moment we're working with the Department to run scenarios that will feed the National Energy and Climate Plan to include the National Development Plan announced policies and measures.
Can I have access to that work?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be publishing a report on the energy projections in the coming weeks. That will include some assessment of the impact of the National Development Plan measures and the impact on renewables outturns for 2020, 2030, and also the emissions balance on the energy-related emissions side. So that will be with you in a couple of weeks.
Can I ask Secretary General, how is it that a National Development Plan was published which had no climate assessment in it before it was agreed?
Sorry, I'm not sure what
How is it that a National Development Plan was signed off by the government before that there was an understanding assessment of what the climate impact of it would be?
Let me consult for a moment, as I'm not sure what exactly the question is that you're
How is it that a National Development Plan was signed off by a government before there was an understanding as to what the climate impact would be?
The analysis there done on the greenhouse gas emissions, Deputy. How our greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced as a result of implementing the National Development Plan. That's my understanding of your question.
So as we've set out in the National Development Plan, many of the measures that we have there in relation to the energy sector are measures that represent a continuation of policies that we know are working on the ground. The increase in the number of homes being retrofit to 45,000 a year. I'll get to the point. Investments in energy efficiency on commercial and public building stock. Supports for changing out of oil-fired boilers, all the renewable energy supports, the transport investment and all the rest. So what we will do now as part of the work feeding into the National Energy and Climate Plan is take that detailed assessment that Jim and the people who are working with them in the SCAI and the TRAM and see exactly where that level of investment positions us in terms of meeting our 20 targets. The whole purpose of the National Energy and Climate Plan is to look at sensible things that have included in the National Mitigation Plan, self-evident measures that have been included in the National Development Plan, which will give a very significant carbon reduction dividend, and make that assessment then as to what additional mitigation measures may need to be included to ensure that the target that we have set for 2030 is achievable.
I'm asking my questions very quickly, and I don't mean to be rude or seem to be rude, but I do go back to the question, why was the National Development Plan was signed off before we knew what the climate impact of it would be?
Well, the National Development Plan contains a whole suite of measures across a whole range of sectors, amounting to somewhere in the region of 115 billion, of which we managed to corner about 20% of the spend. I think the prudent course is, as we have set out, which is that we take the impact of the National Development Plan measures, the impact of the flexibilities that are included in the effort sharing regulation, the assessment of the impact of each individual measure in the National Mitigation Plan, draw a conclusion as to whether that will fully meet the 2030 target. I don't expect it will. And see then what additional measures we need to bring forward, whether it's in the nature of further investment, whether it's in the nature of regulation, and whether it's in the nature of taxation to plug the gaps that will arise on the various targets that we've set out.
I'm hoping we can help you here, because I do have the sense of thinking of the film Jaws, you know, when they get that scene, they see the big shark going by and think we're going to need a bigger boat. We're going to need a hell of a bigger boat to tackle climate change, and you've got a critical position in that regard, and our job is to help you, I think, in that way. But I'd have to say I agree with your own Minister when you say that the National Mitigation Plan is not working, was a failure. And I personally, with the National Development Plan, is completely in the wrong direction. 65 major new motorways and national roads. Burning peat to 2030 is a climate crime. Agricultural emissions are rising into that plan. We've no plans or legislation for plastics recycling or the development of circular economy. There's no forestry plan in the plan. I could go on in each and every sector. And I have a real problem with where we are. The question is, not that sort of, you know, I wouldn't start from here. Well, none of us would start from here. But I just asked the question because I think there should be an honest assessment that the National Development Plan is not fit for purpose in climate, and it's going to have to change as part of our submission to the National Energy Climate Action Plan, which has to be done by Christmas. First draft. And we've got a role in that, and we want to open it up and see what can we do to help. Can you present this committee a copy of that first report that the Project Ireland 2040 delivery group delivered to government last week? Could we have access to that report?
I understand it was to be published. Let me check, and I'll see what the position is in relation to that.
If you could get
sorry. Yeah, just to come back on the National Mitigation Plan. In fact, my own minister did not admit it was a failure.
He said it wasn't working.
There was a report in the paper that I think was a bit unfair to what he actually said, because I listened to the transcript of the interview and he never said that. The circular economy, I agree with you, there are things there that may well feature in the National Energy and Climate Plan. Like, I suppose the important thing is, when the NDP was published, we hadn't yet finished the negotiations on the Renewable Energy Directive. We were still in trialogue with the European Parliament around targets.
We were fighting it in every turn. In each of those European packages, I saw the files coming from Brussels, and in each case we were fighting it. And that makes me think Europe is not going to be easy for us in this whole process. We're going to have a tough job to explain to them what we're doing. And I'd love to see, if you want to see the circular economy going, that your department might stop fighting the waste reduction bill that I think it helps us and has been there sitting for the last year. Can I just ask one other question? Why is it you're going to publish next week the first draft of this National Energy Climate Action Plan?
It's a consultation paper. It's not the first draft. No.
Okay, it's a consultation paper.
Yeah.
Can we asked last week, could we see that? And we were told no. Does it exist, that consultation paper, at the present time in a way that we could see it now before it goes to public consultation?
I expect the Minister will be in a position to clear that very, very shortly, so we can get it into the committee at that point. Just to come back on your point, Deputy, because I don't think it's a fair reflection of what the Department was doing at EU level. We have always made the point in discussions at the EU level that what emerges has to be fair, achievable, affordable and cost effective, and that is a duty.
We were assessed by Climate Action Network, who assessed what's going on in Europe as being the second worst, and I could go through each file and each paper line by line and show the amendments we tried to make, which were all seen in the European climate community as regressive and gave Ireland the same reputation as Poland. That's the reality.
Yeah. So that is one perspective on it. And the Taoiseach said himself, and he spoke to the European Parliament at the start of the year, that we were a laggard. When you look at the definition of laggard, it means slow progress. I'm not denying that there has been slow progress, but there are a whole range of reasons why there has been slow progress over the last number of years. When we set our targets in 2009, it was just ahead of the biggest economic recession that this state experienced, when unemployment went from just over 4% to 15.6%. When GDP plummeted. No, I think it's important to make these points because you're making sweeping statements yourselves. We had to ensure that when we came out of the processes around the effort-sharing regulation, that the ask of the Irish economy and of the Irish people was fair, achievable,
I suppose it does depend on your perspective, and I have the perspective that it's going to be good for the Irish economy. This is not easy, and other countries aren't that good either. It's a difficult process. Can I just ask one further question to you, if I can, one last question to the SB, if I can, Chair. I think the governance package is a good one, and I think this National Energy and Climate Action Plan structure is right, because it says we have to think 30 years in advance. So we got to think big. We got to think we're going to be doing 20 gigawatts of offshore, 5 gigawatts of interconnection. 1 million homes are going to have to be retrofitted. We're going to have to spend 5 million on social homes. It's that kind of big thinking. and we stop thinking, can we just about do the minimum so that we get away with scraping in? Because the reality is, as John Fitzgerald said, who I think is a fair, neutral observer, to back up what I've been saying, we are completely off course and heading rapidly in the wrong direction. So this is the moment between now and Christmas when we turn the entire thinking. We need a Whittaker-Lemass moment, and to be honest, I didn't feel it and hear it here today. I hope we can work together in the next three months to turn it into an ambition that we then can turn into a reality. And there's all sorts of uncertainties. It's not an easy process. You have a tough job, but we should be ambitious.
Well, I certainly won't argue with you on that point. And I mean, when I'm talking about how we position the negotiations at EU level, I think we were being fair, recognising where we're starting from. That doesn't mean that I want to see in 2030 Ireland saying again, we haven't achieved a target. And there is, and I can assure you of this, there is a huge commitment at government level to ensure that what we have now agreed to at EU level, both in terms of renewable energy and the effort share and regulation and ETS, that we'll deliver. We have some of the building blocks in place in terms of the National Mitigation Plan, the National Adaptation Framework, the National Development Plan. Circular economy, I think, will plug into this now that we have a better understanding of what's emerging from the circular economy. And we will, and I mean, we'll be tested very rigorously on this, not just at national level by the Oireachtas, but by the European Commission. We will be tested very rigorously to ensure that what we produce in the National Energy and Climate Plan can deliver by 2030. And if you look at the way it's structured, we will be reviewed regularly in terms of progress both on the renewable energy, energy efficiency and climate targets by the European Commission, and there are measures in there to make sure that if we don't comply, well then we will suffer accordingly.
Two very last questions if I can to the speech here, just briefly. First, it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen in 2050. That's what we're trying to do here. I'd love ESB to present other experts. I mean, I know Poiriers have done this report, they're very credible, but what energy expert believes that biomass and power generation is going to be the real future, particularly in recent years when the cost of alternative renewables have plummeted, and it's all about interconnection, and which you didn't mention, and storage. And I have to say, I would love to see CCS happening, but again, look at the cost of renewables plummeting. CCS ain't happening anywhere really at scale. Could you present me some other independent energy experts who think biomass and power generation for Ireland makes sense? I'd love to compare with, I think, some of the international think tanks I could bring in who'd say that's cuckoo. Last question. You said you need state intervention, state support for power stations for the EV vehicles, which I fully agree with. How much and what would you spend? If you're Pascal Dunner's next door, I'm going to go into him now. How much should I be asking for, and what should he spend it on?
Yeah, I'll take the second question. Let's take the second part first. It's a number of small millions to deal with, small tens of millions to deal with the fast charging networks. That's where I'd spend it, the fast charging network. On the motorways, on the main thoroughfares. As I mentioned earlier, our EV business unit, e-cars, their analysis would indicate that the vast majority of charging will be done at home rather than on journey. So I'd spend it on the fast charging network on motorways, but I'd also spend it on revamping the existing set of public chargers, right? But I think it's a relatively small expenditure in the overall scale of discussing, multi-billions of euros of transition costs across the entire energy sector. This is a small piece of it.
25.
That would go a long way. Yeah. Now, I would like to go back and actually check that number, right? I haven't come in with a number around that, but that's my assessment. My instinct would be that it's a relatively small compared to the other costs of meeting the transition.
Could you come back to the committee in writing on
I certainly can. I certainly can.
We would expect as well, sorry, just to cut in, we would expect as well to see applications into the department by the 1st of October for this infrastructure as part of the first round of the Climate Action Fund.
I think in terms of your first question, Deputy, 2050 is a long way away, but the electricity system requires large, long-term planning, right? Our analysis would indicate that we need to maintain some form of balancing power on the system to balance out renewables. Our 2050 position, we're seeing renewables grow to 50% by the middle of the next decade, and beyond that up to around 65–70% when we get towards the 2040–2050 mark. A lot of the roadmaps we have looked at, whether to be, I'm going to talk to John now in a second in relation to UCC, but I'm pretty sure the UCC roadmap has biomass as a
totally
key
disagree
part.
with it.
But it's in there. You asked me what other experts, right? So UCC are experts in this area, and that roadmap has biomass in it. Biomass, are there issues with it? Yes, there are. No doubt there are. But from an Ireland Inc. perspective and looking at the options that we have, we're not going to have nuclear. Biomass, there are issues with it, but it can contribute somewhat, but it will not deal with the balance of power that we need to deliver. And that's where we come to CCS as being a technology which hasn't had the investment that we would like to have seen happening over the last 10 odd years. We think increasingly it's going to have to be required, because there will be a requirement on having relatively large-scale, high-inertia plant on the system to balance out the intermittent renewables. Now, technology could change, right? So you could have major advances in power electronics, which would allow a larger scale of intermittent sources of power on the system. But that's not where we are right now. And go back 18 months ago, again at this committee, and there was a question about what our long-term ambition might be. And the Chief Executive of Eirgrid mentioned 75% as being a level of intermittency that he could see a pathway to. Now, at that time, 18 months ago, Eirgrid were at 60%. They've since got up to 65%. So he said we could see a pathway to 75%, but couldn't see a pathway beyond that at that point in time. They've now gone as far as 65%. We need to get to 75% in order to deliver 50% average renewables on the system. So it's a big ask. We're at the leading edge of this in Ireland, and you should be very, very proud of it. But I think there is a requirement for us to look at how we're going to make up the last leg of this race. And we think CCS, we think Ireland uniquely has a requirement for CCS when you look at us across the rest of Europe, because we don't have large-scale hydro, we don't have large-scale nuclear, we don't have the options that other European countries have.
Thank you. I might go to Deputy Chambers next. Here. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to thank everyone. Apologies, I missed some of the contributions. I was in and out at other bit busy day on a Wednesday. I wanted to start, and apologies if some of the questions have been asked. Just regarding, I asked last week a question of our speaker just around retrofitting, and is the quality of retrofitting at present, does it match European standards, and does it future-proof, that we won't have to redo that process, and also around new builds. What are our present standards around new builds in the context of climate proofing those? And just maybe a question for the department around public buildings. What spark can you deliver to try and future-proof all capital investment around climate change? Because as the Chair mentioned at the start, we've new schools being built that probably will require retrofitting. We've lots of capital investment around, and an acceleration of that going forward. So when can you, say to this committee or a future Oireachtas that we're now climate-proofing everything that's happening around public investment, and does there need to be a legislative context or framework to that? I know it's a complex piece, but I think that has to happen if we're going to flip the balance around this, where we've continuous capital investment that will require, we require proper climate proofing. So I don't know if you want to just answer those questions initially.
I'll bring in the SCAI first, Mr. Halpin. Don't you want those?
So in respect of retrofitting, we have a very active number of schemes in home energy grants across those who can pay and the energy poor, and up to and including special interest groups in the fuel poor area. So to date we've retrofitted, or through our schemes, 360,000 homes have been retrofitted, and the state has invested of the order of €460 million in those retrofits. Now they are on a scale they would be deemed to be from shallow to moderate retrofit. That is because most of the schemes have taken a relatively piecemeal approach, so it could be anything from attic insulation or wall insulation or combinations thereof. More recently, We've introduced a deep retrofit scheme which is looking at precisely the measure you refer to, Deputy Chambers, which is how to take the home as a holistic energy system and look at its precise needs and then decide what is the most appropriate solution for that. And what we're investigating there is how to bring homes to an A rating, A3 or better, and that's all the way from G upwards, so a starting point can be very poor. It's a very significant investment, and that's the thing about it, that you go from a possible investment of maybe somewhere in the region of 5, 10, 15k all the way up to, in the deep retrofit, you're talking 50, 60, 70k, and we're supporting that at the moment in the region of 50% grant schemes. We've done we've 36 projects approved so far, and they're going to demonstrate what is possible. But it's not only the technical solution that's necessary to unlock this. First of all, there's the willingness of people to make that investment, and that's the sort of analysis we're doing through our behavioural economics team as to what are the triggers for people to actually make this investment, rather than making the investment in, say, aesthetic aspects of their home or holidays or cars, because there are other competing priorities always. The other thing is then to look at how this is financed. The state, currently, if that was to proceed, the state would have to invest 50% of all those homes that are at a value of 30,000, 40,000 euro each. So what we need to look at is, for those who can afford to finance this sort of activity, to see how to unlock low interest finance. And we're engaged in a number of pilot programs, both with banks and with credit unions, and to look at what are the trusted lenders in this sphere. Of course, what this points to as well is there is no silver bullet. Had that silver bullet been around, I presume Mark Griffin would have liked to have had it many moons ago, or many others. But there is no silver bullet, and it will be a case of trying to find the combinations and the many combinations that work in different environments. And all along, we'll have to be conscious then of the energy poor sector, those who are incapable of affording this. They will have to be brought along, and that will probably have to be 100% subvented by the state, as it currently is.
And just on that, so I mean, obviously, when you're advancing the more complex piece, I suppose it goes back to the question on the grid and micro generation. I think that would be the big incentive. How does a home become an actual export unit in itself? And where are we on that going forward? I think that would be the thing that would flip the domestic, I suppose, behavioural economics of where the home can, or a group of homes within an estate can become an export unit. I think that, for me, would say, well, not only will you have no bill, but you'll be able to export onto a grid, and I think that's the.
I think in time that is likely to come about, and when you aim at near zero energy buildings, and it should be said that the new regulations that are coming in next year, not only do they bring in near zero as an energy performance requirement for new build, which will, and in truth, Ireland's building regulations have all along been very advanced, but the new regulation brings in that if you're renovating or more than 25% of a building, you are going to have to move it to at least a level B. So that means that as soon as you tack a house for renovations to put on a conservatory or to put on an attic or build over the garage, you're starting to get into the space where the whole home has to be taken as an energy system. Now, I think in time it will come to a point where people will be chasing additional source of income through being energy positive. But I think in the first case, the incentive is, one, to get the bills down to near zero. But actually moving a person to a point where they say, well, am I prepared to invest that level of money and wait 30 years for the payback, or wait 20 years for the payback if they're not getting incentives? That is a harder nut to crack.
And when will we be able to crack that nut, just maybe from the ESB? When do you expect that to be a possibility? I know it's a complex piece, but I'm just interested here. Yeah.
I'll come in on for a few bits. The first thing that strikes me is, even just talking about the retrofits, you've heard there from Tom Halpin from the SEAI how big a task it is to deliver retrofits, deep retrofits of scale. And when Máire Donnelly was in here last week, she talked about dealing with the problem of new houses, and we must stop the leak. And I wouldn't mind just reiterating that point here, that we're putting carbon into new houses at a time when we don't need to, because the energy efficiency of those new houses is so good, you definitely do not need anything other than a heat pump to heat those houses. That's the first point I make. In respect of being able to have houses which can export generation onto the grid, excess generation onto the grid, Right now, commercially, ESB is the only supplier we know of that provides any sort of scheme that does that, which is currently closed. But I'd like to make clear to people present that ESB receives no money for the generation that it pays the people who provide for it for. Okay? So it's a service we provide, we pay people, but we get no money back. Okay? The systems in place aren't in place for us to get paid for that electricity. So the question you've asked, effectively under the Renewable Electricity Directive, there's an obligation in there that we must all end up putting in place systems that will allow parties who export onto the grid with their excess generation to be paid a reasonable rate. So that puts a timeline on a solution to this problem being found, which I believe is by end 2020. I'm not 100% sure but when the Renewables Directive comes into force and international legislation, but that will effectively put a timeline on resolution of this problem, whereby we'll have to have our systems in place to facilitate that. But it's clear to me that smart meters will be a key element in the delivery of being able to pay people appropriately for their excess generation.
Question for the department as well, Deputy.
Just maybe to pick up on a couple of issues that you've raised, Deputy Chambers, and maybe add to the figures that SEAI have given you in terms of the number of houses that have been retrofitted over the last number of years. Important to as well recognise that there's a big programme of work ongoing in the local authority sector, and from 2013 to 2017 there's about 116 million spent, and 64,000 local authority homes getting an energy efficiency upgrade. On the public buildings and the climate proofing, I'll ask the guys to take it from two elements. First of all, Michael will talk to you about what we're doing in terms of energy efficiency in the public sector, and there's a lot of good things to say about that. And then there's the kind of flip side to that, and it's more to do with the adaptation end and how is it you climate-proof infrastructure within our public system. And I'll ask John O'Neill to say something on that.
I'm just on the public sector. The public sector was given a higher target than the rest of the economy back in the start of this decade. It's given a target of 33%. Currently, we're at about 20 of that 33%, and we are making good progress. Now, one of the things which we've, as a department, been concerned about is putting energy efficiency centre stage in terms of public bodies. I mean, understandably, people in the justice sector are concerned about justice rather than the buildings which they occupy, and same goes for education, healthcare and that. So government approved a new programme last year on public sector energy efficiency, and a large part of it is focused on governance and making sure that everybody in the public sector has an energy performance officer within there and reports regularly on what is being achieved. Now, that's part of the governance, part of the structure and part of the reporting, but we've also matched that with funding. 14 million we provided last year and this year to OPW, and it's been looking again at pilot projects. I'm sorry to keep using the word pilot project because I know it sounds like it's all kind of sampling, but the reality is we're testing a lot of new things, testing a lot of new techniques, our building supply chains, our building experiences. Traditional building methodologies were very forgiving. If the door was a little too wide, the lintel was so strong, it held up everything anyway. A lot of the new technologies are very technically specific. They've got to be installed expertly. They've got to be maintained expertly. And building that capacity within the system is really, really important. And that's why the focus has been so heavily on the pilot phasing, certainly in 17, 18, and probably into next year. So I think we are on a good trajectory. There is a specific provision in the National Development Plan for public sector buildings. I forgot to bring a copy, so I can't remember the number, but I have no problem kind of relaying it to the committee clerk on that front. So there is a reorientation. The actual fact that government has endorsed a new strategy and put it that every single body has to report in terms of where they're at. And Secretary General has just found investment in energy efficiency of existing commercial and public sector buildings with a target of all public buildings at least 1/3 of total commercial premises upgrading to BER rating B. That's over the life cycle of the.
I keep this under my pillow.
Interest.
It's D1.
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 Yeah,
but we're leaving.
The problem
Here.
Not because of that though. The problem with a lot of government premises is they're rented.
Yeah.
But we will be moving in the next number of years to a custom-built, environmentally sustainable, energy-efficient, bells and whistles, you name it.
We'll be bringing in the OPW here as well to our committee in relation to that public buildings.
I think John wanted to come in on the adaptation.
I'll be very brief. It was just really to kind of talk about the other side of what Mark mentioned in terms of climate proofing from the adaptation side. I think that's kind of a key challenge for the sectors. So we kind of mentioned earlier that we have kind of 12 sectors under 7 government departments. I think kind of, so for example, on the energy and the gas network side of things, it's not just about the kind of decarbonisation, but it's also about kind of how do you actually kind of make that infrastructure climate resilient into the future in terms of the impacts of climate change. Same for transport, same for agriculture, same for all the sectors that they have to think about this. And right down to the local authorities actually as well in terms of the plans that they will have. So there is that kind of drip down from the national side down to the regional and local. Every decision that is taken has to kind of think about that from a climate resilience point of view.
Just final question. I just want to quickly about electric cars. It's more just a technical. I just want to. Obviously, you're investing in trying to roll out more charges across the city and elsewhere, and that's welcome. But if you look at the pipeline battery technology, I suppose the way I see it, within 10 years, most people, the battery capacity of an electric car will probably be greater than a present combustion model. So do we need to run an economic model on our investment in the actual battery points whereby most people will probably utilise more energy efficient battery charging at home? And should we be trying to incentivise that in as much as in terms of our economic model of electric cars as we are charging points? Because I think obviously it's important we encourage electric cars, but I'd say within 10 to 15 years the fuel station will be in big trouble, but so will the electric charge points that we're probably going to spend a significant amount of money on.
Bring in Martin Manley on that one.
Deputy, sorry, you're preaching our hymn. We know that the range of batteries is increasing, and it will be a challenge to get the balance right between putting enough in for this transition phase and not ending up with stranded assets. Because charging at home fits with most life cycle and with technology issues, but we have to manage the present as well as plan for the future. So getting that balance right will be really challenging.
Senator Mulherin, finally.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, and apologies. We've had a lot of votes in the Shannon today, so had to be present for those. I'm sorry if some of this is, if there's repetition in it. I suppose firstly I just wanted to ask about the new nearly zero energy building standard that will face us at the end of this year and going forward. And we have plans, and it is necessary that we have to build a lot of houses, and that's the topic of conversation every day. And I'm just wondering, from the point of view of both private houses, say your 4-bed semi-D, or indeed social housing that's going to be built, how much per unit is it going to add on to each house to ensure that the NZEB standard is achieved? So compared to how it is now, what in addition do we have to budget for to make sure that we are that we meet this cost? Also, I wanted to ask, where people have retrofitted and made their houses more energy efficient, as we go forward and we're looking at carbon taxes, will households which have invested heavily in making their houses more carbon efficient, less reliant on carbon, and in fact where some people might even look at the possibility of going offline and not actually feeding into taking their electricity from the grid at all, as we look at solar, we look at different ways people can become self-sufficient. How should it, maybe this is a policy thing, how should this play into how we're going to levy carbon taxes? Are we basically just going to look at people getting their electricity bill and there's going to be another PSO levy on it, universally applied across the board? I think there's a space there to incentivise people and to reward people, because obviously you have mentioned there that people are going to be looking to borrow that you're looking at low-cost loans to try and help people to borrow to make their houses or their properties more energy efficient. A lot of money, I heard you mention 30,000, 40,000. I'm not sure was that for a domestic building or commercial or whatever. But these are very stark realities, and I think that the idea, or the fact that new builds and major renovations are going to be hit by this requirement and the additional cost will be news to a lot of people. It's generally not. I'm not saying it's not been talked about, but an awful lot of stuff to do with energy efficiency, climate change, and that. Sometimes it just, the message doesn't ring clearly, or people just don't get to hear it. Mr. Griffin, you mentioned, and I suppose you were pointing to the progress that the Department of Local Government, Housing and so on is making in investing in upgrading local authority housing stock. Well, basically, as I see it, and we've had this discussion when John Fitzgerald was in here as well, like the upgrade that they're doing is they're basically putting in a more efficient oil boiler. That's what they're doing, and you're going to be stuck with that oil boiler for the next 15 to 20 years. People are not getting any choice in relation to what type of heating system they have. In fact, if you're in a local authority house, you're being presented with very few choices. The choices are being made for you, and yet you are going to pay for them, whether it's a carbon tax on the coal or whatever else. So I am concerned about the measures that there's already been substantial funding spent by the Department of Housing on these upgrades, and I'm just questioning, is this really good value for money? And when these upgrades are being done, what difference are we seeing in the energy rating? Like, what's the average energy rating of houses that have been upgraded by the local authorities that you have referred to? And I suppose at this stage, with the amount of money that has been spent via SEAI, grant aiding people to upgrade the energy rating of their house, I mean, how many A grades have we got now? B or A grades have we got? And I'm sorry I didn't get your figures as to how many houses have been grant aided and how many more units. But what is the cost of this? To Mr. Griffin as well, it's an issue that I have raised going back, and I know quite a while actually. I think even when Minister Rabbit was in the position, the whole issue of land use. And it seemed always to me that on the one hand you had the Department of Agriculture setting out their 2025 targets, and then we had your department, Mr. Griffin, talking about energy crops and carbon sequestration and all this sort of thing. And the problem being that nobody seemed to be talking to the other in any formal way about, well, because obviously there's only a limited amount of land, and how you're going to use the land has to be by agreement or whatever, or that the plans need to have some interaction. And I'm just wondering, in a formal way, what's agreed between ye? And how do you view the targets in Foodwise 2025? We've been told that land use is an issue or a problem. And we're even told, as regard on the agriculture side, with a man from Antashka here, you're reclaiming your land, certain land, it's releasing excess carbon, so that basically, where farmers are trying to make land more productive, that they shouldn't really be doing it. So I think there's an awful lot of gaps between the Department of Agriculture and your department in relation to this issue, and that these need to be filled in to give a clearer picture as to what we're doing and what direction we're going in. So the question really is, what formally has been done, what agreements are in place, etc., between ye, because I know going back to that time, and I'd asked the question of both ministers, both the Minister for Agriculture and Minister Abbott at the time, and continue to ask it over a period of time, and there was never an answer to that question. And then I suppose on the issue of renewable electricity on the grid, maybe particularly for ESB, and I'm sure it's something the department have an interest in. Like, without a doubt, there's serious challenges around transmission, and there's been talk here of offshore wind, etc. But even parts of the country where there's onshore wind, we don't have grid. Like, we don't have proper grid, and it's very piecemeal. And we know that, say, for example, Grid West was abandoned, and there were issues around Grid West, and I would suggest there's issues around the fact that, the state at the time, or government at the time, wouldn't, and EirGrid wouldn't contemplate undergrounding. And I know they're mandated to get the most efficient and cheapest way to deliver grid. But the reality is it has cost so much and there's so much delay in actually realising the build-out of transmission that obviously that should be taken into account, in my view. I'm just wondering, how are the issues around grid going to be overcome? And particularly if you go offshore wind, I know in my own county we have a test site. I know it's a wave test site, SEAI wave test site, and I know that's probably a bit more into the future, but there's obviously potential for offshore wind there as well. But we have no transmission, we have no grid other than to Bellacorrick, where there's a former peat burning power station. There's no grid whatsoever. So any electricity that's going to be generated there will be on the distribution line or whatever way they do it. And it just seems that the whole issue has not been tackled. The concerns of communities have not been tackled. And I suppose particularly for ESB, it's their sphere or their area. Like, what's the way forward on this? You know, I know there's always this talk about rewarding communities, but I mean, surely it has to be to an extent. And I know EirGrid are charged with rolling out the transmission infrastructure, but surely there has to be more looking at undergrounding. I understand equally you could maybe bring electricity around offshore, that's potentially the case as well. And I know this will all add to cost, but I suppose there'd be my questions.
EirGrid as well, Senator, just to let you know, in relation to the grid, we're going to bring in EirGrid. Yeah. Yes. Who would like Mark Griffin? Yeah.
Start. Just on the local authority housing stock, I can't actually give you the answers, Senator Mulherin, on that and the decisions they have made in terms of the choices of technology. I don't know whether SEAI can do that, but I think the SecGen is coming in. Just to say, in relation to the schemes that the SEAI support, since the start of this year, the decision was taken that we wouldn't fund oil boilers as part of any of the upgrades. The carbon transition or the transition to a low carbon economy is not going to be cheap, and I think part of the issue that we have to think about in the centre, and are doing so already, is how you engage with communities to explain this, so that there is going to be a cost involved, but there will be benefits in the long term in terms of health, environment, social, economic, jobs and all that kind of stuff. So there's certainly a job of work to be done in the centre and local and regional level to explain that, and I think the National Dialogue on Climate Action will have a role in relation to that. You mentioned Foodwise 2025, and again, you'll have my colleagues from the Department of Agriculture in with you shortly enough. We are working very closely, and have done so, with the Department of Agriculture around bioenergy, biomass, carbon sequestration, energy crops. We are talking, and have been talking for quite some time, and trying to align what sometimes appear like the policy tensions that exist, say, between the targets under Foodwise 2025 and the things we need to do to try and decarbonise a lot of sectors that are in the non-ETS sector. My department at Assistant Secretary level is represented on the Foodwise 2025 High-Level Implementation Group. We have an Assistant Secretary from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine represented on the group chaired by Minister Naughton in relation to climate action, and we are teasing out issues around, looking at everything we've done across all the sectors and the commitments that exist, what are the other things that we need to do, realising the pressures in particular sectors to ensure that commitments we have entered into will absolutely be met by 2030. I might ask Frank to say something about the issue of carbon tax and the point you made about people investing in energy improvements, and how will that be taken into account in the design of a carbon tax system. And then when Frank's done, perhaps SEAI could comment on the NZEB, on what it entails and the cost there.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose, just an answer to the Senator's question, if I understand it correctly, it's really, if you consider the carbon tax as a sort of a consumption tax on fossil fuels, which applies to householders, applies to people driving cars, applies to businesses in terms of how they heat their buildings, etc. The more the types of interventions that we've been discussing this afternoon are rolled out, and the less fossil fuels are used in the transport system, in the built environment, the less liability people will have to pay the carbon tax because their consumption of fossil fuels will go down. So from that point of view, carbon tax is a price signal to householders and to other consumers in the economy to sort of say, we want you to consume less of fossil fuels in your day-to-day activities and how you heat your homes and how you drive your cars. So it will be of benefit to the consumer who decides to invest in a deep retrofit of their house, because ultimately they will end up paying less in carbon tax because of the fact that they're consuming less fossil fuels. That's a very simple answer. Now, obviously, there's a separate question in terms of where the carbon tax will go over time, which I spoke briefly about earlier. And, you know, there is a question, and the committee has already heard advice on this and discussed this with the Advisory Council as to where the carbon tax might need to go in the medium term to make sure the signal to householders and to other consumers is strong enough to create that incentive in the economy as well. So the two types of interventions, if I can call them that, travel in parallel, and they affect, I suppose, the decision-making process for consumers, for householders, for firms, in terms of when they come to make the types of interventions, make the types of investments in upgrading their homes, in replacing their vehicles, etc. So it's all part of a package. I hope that answered the question. I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at in your question.
Yeah, well, yes, it's basically people who have, yes, it is, yeah.
Do you want to come in, Mr. Howard?
Yeah, just coming on to the point. In regards to the NZEB regulations, or the Near Zero Energy Building regulations, and how much they're likely to add to the cost of unit, I can't say that specifically because that's a matter that would be dealt with by the Department of Housing. But what I can explain is that the principle underlying the NZEB regulations, and it's set out across the EU under the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive, is that based on an econometric model, that the additional cost of the works involved in achieving the near zero energy performance actually is recovered over the duration of over the period of ownership of the property. So it pays for itself. So it does have an added cost, but it pays for itself in the reduced energy.
But also, you mentioned a figure of 30 to 40,000 there.
What I was mentioning there was the cost of going from, under our deep retrofit pilot programme, as we're experiencing at the moment, is the cost of upgrading, say, an F or an E rated property up to an A rated property. That's an upgrade, so it's retrofitting, taking an existing building and actually upgrading its performance as a housing system, and that will cost in the order of, could be 50, 60, 70,000 euro to achieve that. Now, that's getting to A-rated. I also mentioned that under the building regulations, that where a person is doing renovation work and it impacts more than 25% of the property, they will have to do energy efficiency works. But that only requires them to bring it up to a B rating. Now, the step between B and A rating is quite substantial. So there's a number of different parts that I referenced there. One is the deep retrofit pilot, and one is the requirements under the building regulations. And one is going to A and the other one is going to B.
Just on a point, just briefly, we discuss affordability in housing all the time, but obviously if you're going to be slapping another 40 grand on the basic cost of building a house to make it energy efficient, then that's going to further impact on property not being affordable. I understand well what you're saying, that over time these things pay for themselves, but the problem is people have to come up with money up front to pay for these things, and that is a challenge. Like, it cannot be sneezed at.
Yeah, no, and sorry, I think you're conflating 2 points that I've made there. I've actually said I have no sense of what the additional costs are, and I don't know what their order of magnitude. That's a matter for the Department of Housing. We don't own or apply the building regulations. That's the Department of Housing. So I don't know that the number 40,000 is about retrofitting, so building a house, or sorry, upgrading a house if you are undertaking renovations. So the additional cost onto a house between a current building regulations house, which actually has a very, very high energy performance, it has to be said, and bringing it to the NZEB under the new regulations which come in next year. So for building a new, I have no sense of that. So to use a 40,000 and impacting on affordability is conflating 2 points.
So who will the Department of Housing turn to for this type of information? Aren't you the experts?
No,
the
Department of Housing are responsible for regulations.
But they're not. You're the energy efficiency
no,
experts.
they write the regulations.
They have their own building regulations experts internally in the department who have responsibility for the building regs and have a very significant range of expertise in this area.
We can ask them. Indeed, but my simple point is that obviously if you're going to be adding, this is going to again impact on the cost of housing and delivery.
And this is where the financing comes into finding new ways of financing, be it through the credit union, post
But that's in retrofit. We're looking at financing in retrofit. So again, I think it's important maybe just to separate the 2 points. New regulations relate to new houses. The additional cost that's likely to impact there has not been defined in this room and is a matter for the Department of Housing. The separate issue in regards to retrofit, yes, a deep retrofit is likely to cost of the order of 40, 50, 60,000 euro. If a person decides to undertake that, we need to explore financing options. But there are 2 different requirements.
I understand, but under these NZEB standards, and if they're doing a substantial renovation, they don't have any choice. Like you're saying if they decide to do this. But they will be compelled to bring it up to a B energy rating.
Yes. So
it's not a question. At the moment, I can choose or not choose. If I do something substantial at my house that reaches that threshold, I'm required to go to a B rating. So you're not in the realm of choice anymore. You have to do it, and you'll have to spend. And I guess the reason I'm pressing it is that I think this is an ideal opportunity for us to get to grips with what it is going to cost us to transition. And that's why I think figures are critical, and this is going to impact on ordinary people.
Well,
and how we pay for it is a whole policy debate, but we need to see figures. And I think when you hear these figures and you hear about the obligations under the NZEB standard, it is very stark. It's very stark how we will have to pay for this, along with how we have to support electricity. This is a major undertaking, which I suppose my colleague here to the left keeps telling us about, but it certainly is. But, you know, people need to know this. This is very serious as far as I'm concerned.
And it was for the benefit of for the purposes of our report, at the end of our work here, it's important that we are able to assess when we're putting in place a particular measure or incentive that we're not disenfranchising a particular sector of society who can't afford it. Yeah. Sorry, Michael Manley wanted to come in.
Senator, this may not give you any great comfort either. I'm sorry to say.
Don't say.
But let's be honest, I think it's the purposes of this committee. Now, you asked about the design of the new market and whether people who might say, I want to be an energy island, and they opt out, would they be faced with a charge? That's a question which will have to be addressed. I mean, Storm Ophelia last year cost 30 million. So if the 20 of us in this room decided we want to be energy islands and opt out, that's 20 less people paying to the cost of that 30 million. Last week, 186,000 homes and businesses were disconnected because of the storm. ESB, I think you had 2,000 people out, you had 500 contractors. I don't know what the costs were yet, but again, that's going to be a cost to the system. So it's not a reason not to do it, but it's one of the complexities we have to deal with in doing it.
The system's going to be the busiest things in this revolution. It's going to be running heat pumps, cars. That system is going to be so busy and so critical and so central. The old argument that it wouldn't be used is nonsense, is out of date now. It's actually how do we get it? How do we cope with the amount of needs and demands of that system is the real skill. That's the front of the industrial revolution in front of us here, Airgrid and ESB, and we're good at it.
Senator
and it shouldn't stop us doing so.
Senator, I have a question about transmission as well.
You want to take the transmission?
Yeah.
I won't address the transition, but generally in terms of like infrastructure build is difficult in Ireland. We've seen that across numerous cases. And you know, I'd be hopeful that the RES consultation that has been done around community engagement, that will be successful in terms of the renewables. And if it is, it might help us develop a model across other areas. Like there's many cases where it's quicker to build a factory than it is to build the capacity to get there. And so there's a balance between having the capacity leading the demand or the demand leading the capacity. And there's cost implications and all that. I know you mentioned, Deputy, the transmission undergrounding. And that's really an issue for Airgrid to consider. But it's more complex than just the the cost of it. If a line goes underground, it may well be a DC line rather than an AC line, and it changes the characteristics of the system. But really, that's a very complex area. And Senator,
I'm sure, I understand, but I'm sure you have a view on it, because the reality is, yes, you're changing technology, you have certain limitations on the DC technology, but that's EirGrid tried to pursue certain policies on Grid West and other areas, the North-South Interconnector, and where are we? We have nothing.
Yeah, look,
and we still have deficiencies in the transmission and our single electricity market. So I think you might have a view on it, but...
Well, look, I'd say it's a very complex area. There are many parameters that actually feed into it. And I suppose in actually solving this into the medium, longer term, we've got to consider all options.
Daly, finally, who's been here all the way through.
Coming in, I apologise.
No, you're fine.
We had a lot of votes at the start, so I'm just trying to catch up with the submissions as the meeting was ongoing, and most people covered questions that I had in mind. But I suppose there are two technical questions almost for the ESB. You said earlier that you actually pay 10 cents per unit for surplus that's been produced by, let it, solar panels or whatever, but you can't charge for that. So where does it go? Just, is it my naivety? But like, if it's going, if you can record it and it's going into the line, is it not being used by the next person down the line and it being put onto their bill? Is the first thing. And the second one, and I don't want this to sound sarcastical, but the ESB are the face of electricity, and there's a lot of talk about electrical vehicles. And I'd just like to know, as a company, in the image we're portraying to people that we're trying to bring along with us in this whole situation, how many of your fleet are electric? And have you any plans to electrify your fleet?
And then those in any order you wish.
I'll let John take the first question, because it's a question I asked him this morning.
Okay.
And, so we'll rehearse on it.
Okay. So where the electricity goes, I could give a really complex answer, but I intend to give a really simple one. It actually reduces everybody else's bill. Okay, so if you spill electricity onto the system, effectively everybody else gets, it's divided amongst 2 million people to reduce their bill.
But how does it get into their residence without going through their meter?
It just follows the laws of physics. It doesn't go. It's not that it doesn't go in through the meter. Everything is still accounted for from the meter at everybody's residence. What happens, this is why I didn't want to get into the technical part, is that the assumed losses on the system have reduced. Okay, so if you consider generators generate electricity, it goes typically in the old days from big generators through the transmission system, through the distribution system, and into people's houses. That process of sending the electricity, transporting it, creates losses. Okay, by producing electricity out into the system, it effectively is minus losses. So that's how it's treated in the system.
But that makes your system more efficient, and therefore you're making money out of it. That makes your system more efficient.
No, it means everybody's bill goes down.
But it makes your system more efficient.
We charge less.
You don't lose from the generation to the consumer, because the loss has been done by the consumer who's given it on. So you have to generate less electricity to get from A to B.
I know what you're saying. It's not we. Remember, all the generators are on the system, all the suppliers are on the system. It's actually all the suppliers, if you could say.
All the suppliers get more efficient.
Yeah, except for it's not that they're more efficient. This is all just ends up being all the losses on the system are paid for by all the suppliers, and they charge all the customers in their bills for the losses.
There's less losses to the supply to you
on my bill. If now at this stage there are people feeding into it.
You don't see, this is what I'm trying to say, it's negative losses. You don't see losses on your bill, you don't see negative losses on your bill. So that's why a note on it that maybe mightn't be too technical or may explain, if you can, and we'll get back to you if you want further clarification on it.
Short question, but I didn't say it'd be a simple answer.
Sorry, Deputy Pringle.
If you could explain how a power plant can generate the same amount of electricity, and you can add the electricity into the electric, and it all goes to loss as well. That would be very interesting. I'd be very interested to see that.
Did you want to come in to answer the...
I think that question deserves a written answer, to be fair, but I think it gets into a complexity that even this morning I was struggling with.
Is it not for EirGrid, that question as well, or is it ESB?
No, it's
the same.
We can deal with it.
Okay,
we can deal with The second question about EVs, Senator, I'll have to come back to you with the number. I don't actually have the actual number now, but you know, we see EVs as being really important into the future. And look, as an example of it, we're building our new head office down at Fitzwilliam, and there will only be 50 car parking spaces in it, and each one of them will be EV proofed from day one in 2021. So we are committed to. I'll come back with the actual numbers. I think one of the constraints we would have is a lot of our vehicles would be heavy vehicles. And to be fair, right now, electrification of transport and vehicles is on the smaller vehicles and the medium size. When you get to the trucks that carry all the equipment out to networks locations, they're less amenable to electrification right now. Now, I suppose to maybe comment on what Deputy Chambers mentioned earlier, when you look at electrification and look at batteries, there's two really big trends in battery technology. One is the energy density of batteries is on a direction upwards, and the second, the cost of batteries on a direction downwards. And it's those two trends that come together that will actually make us believe the electrification of transport is definitely the future. And when those two trends get sufficiently strong, well then electrification of the van and the lorry will come into range as well. And that will allow then the likes of ESB and other companies with a large number of these sort of vehicles to really move our fleet onto an electric vehicle.
You can see what I mean as how important it would be to bring the public with us that the actual ESB van is electric.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much, and thank you. I know it's been a long session, but important for us as members, and thank the members for your patience as well in waiting to get in with your questioning. This meeting of the Joint Oireachtas Committee is adjourned until next Tuesday, the 2nd of October at 6:15 p.m. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Thank you very much.